Thank you. So we have a very full agenda today, and we are going to begin with the State Board Master Plan accomplishments for 2017 and the Master Plan for 2018, presented by Dr. Sarah Morrison and Mr. Spencer Gwozdick.
Great, thank you, Lily. Let me make sure my microphone is on. Let's see, can you hear me? Okay. And again, I'm excited to let Spencer walk through a few things from this past year in terms of some of the accomplishments and some of the challenges that we've faced as a board. As many of you know, most of you know, the master plan is required by statute, but it's really our opportunity as a board to think strategically, both in a short-term basis in terms of each year, what are the policy levers that we're focused on, and those that we think are going to be moving us as a state forward in terms of student achievement, but also sort of in a longer frame and thinking about sort of a 5-year arc for student achievement and looking at sort of our North Star student achievement goals. So we're going to look back at last year again today, and then in the next couple weeks we'll be looking at 18-19 and thinking about sort of the policy work that we have ahead of us, ahead of looking at sort of a major reset after our 5-year mark in 19-20. So I'm going to let Spencer walk through some of the reflections from this past year, and then, like I said, based on feedback from our members, we'll be talking a lot more in the next few weeks about our goals for next year.
Thanks, Sarah. So as we mentioned, this is the master plan extension for the first part of this year. So this covers January through June of 2018. This is a change from previous master plans where we've done it on an annual basis. We're switching to the academic year in order to better align with the work that we do with our schools statewide. And so our goal for the 2018 master plan was to build off of the work that we'd done in 2017, really through the first half of the year, and make sure that we had a strong continuation there as we prepared to switch to the academic year master plan. And this included both the staff's priorities for the work that they've been carrying on, as well as extensive board member input to make sure that we were really aligned there and making sure that the goals and priorities and policy areas that we were pursuing were really well aligned to both the staff and the board members' concerns for the state. So when we switched to the master plan extension in January, we kept the same strategic priority areas that had been established in the 2015-16 academic year when we passed a 5-year master plan. So these priority areas were having high standards and quality measures, making sure that we had great teachers and leaders across the state, ensuring high quality school options, and ensuring public engagement and oversight from ourselves on the board. And so the first of those areas was high standards and quality measures. So the targets that we had set in January were to develop and communicate a plan for reviewing student academic standards, and then to conduct an implementation check on the English language arts standards that the board passed a couple of years ago. So we have now posted a 6-year comprehensive standards review plan on the State Board website, which you can see here. We have plans to review all of the core academic subjects as well as the additional subject areas that the board is required to review. And we've got the different meetings that we have those scheduled for, as well as when those standards will be implemented in schools. And then I believe you'll be hearing later on today about the ELA implementation check, as we have another workshop presentation on that. Then with our next area, we have great teachers and leaders. So our targets there were, first of all, to develop a long-term plan for the teacher preparation report card that's been back under the board's control since 2015. Our plan was also to collaborate with the Department of Education to make sure that we were incorporating the annual reports that are tied to the report card into the comprehensive and interim reviews of all of our EPPs. We also wanted to make sure that we were making policy changes as necessary based off of review of the secondary math and the elementary reading licensure content assessments, which we reviewed last year. And then we also wanted to determine the need for and plan for any additional licensure content assessment review that we felt needed additional support or to be revised at all. And so the staff have developed a larger plan for the report card. We plan to make somewhat more minor changes in the 2018 version of the report card. So we have assembled an advisory council that we're meeting with that includes stakeholders at the district, EPP, and advocacy group levels. and we'll be working with them to make some minor changes within the larger structure of the report card for 2018. And then our plan for 2019 is to go through a more comprehensive review there and see if there are any larger changes we want to make to the performance framework of the report card or to any of the metrics that we're including there.
Just a quick side note there, too. I want to acknowledge Bob Eby, who's our board member serving on that advisory council. We had our first meeting, I think that was last week. So we're thrilled to have you as part of that group.
Absolutely. And then this batch of provider approval reviews that we'll be conducting at this meeting will be the last one before the annual reports begin to be incorporated. And this year was the first year that the Department of Education produced performance reports for our EPPs. So those set the standards of which providers are not meeting expectations. And so next year, we will be able to see who has failed to meet expectations for 2 years in a row, which would trigger an interim review. And then we will be also sharing an update to the professional assessments policy on first reading at the meeting tomorrow. And so in conjunction with the Department of Education, State Board staff have reviewed the elementary reading assessments and secondary math assessments. We'll be making a change in the middle grades assessment. We'll be switching to the Professional Evaluation Services, I believe is the name, from Pearson that will allow us to test for middle grades as well as Algebra 1 and Integrated Math 1 with that assessment. And then with the secondary math assessment, we'll be adding in the NES assessment as an alternative to the practice exams that are currently in use. So that'll give us more opportunities to make sure that our teachers have opportunities in secondary math, which is an area we've seen shortages across the state, to make sure that they're having as many different tests as we think are qualified to see if they're prepared to make students succeed in the classroom. And so that'll help to address shortages in that area, we hope, and we'll see based off of the data with those two assessments which we end up feeling more confident in. And then finally, we're making a change to the elementary content assessments that will shift to a more comprehensive exam there that has sub-scores for the different content areas. And so within those, we'll need to have a passing score in order to earn licensure. And so another goal that area that we had was high quality school options. So our targets there were to complete the pre-opening work for the KIPP Nashville Primary School. That'll be opening in this fall. We also wanted to work with the Department of Education to comply with the High Quality Charter Schools Act. And then finally, we also had a goal of developing a performance framework and an annual report on the state board's authorized charter schools. So as I mentioned, KIPP Nashville Primary will be opening this fall. It's starting in August with kindergartners, and we'll expand from there. The first year, they'll be co-locating, and after that, moving to another campus. But we're excited about that. And with regards to the standards related to charter school authorizing, the board passed the quality charter authorizing policy in April, and we'll be voting on a charter authorizer fee rule at this meeting on first reading. And then state board staff have also been monitoring progress with the already opened school in Memphis, and we'll be continuing to monitor progress on that in KIPP Nashville Primary and plan to release a report on the state board's authorizing practices by December of this year. Then in our final area, we have public engagement and oversight. We wanted to make sure that we were tracking board member media engagement as that remains a priority for ensuring transparency across the state. We wanted to continue holding days in the district with members, including days in the district with multiple members converging to come together for those. We also wanted to increase our member involvement with the state board authorized schools. So Bluff City High School in Memphis and KIPP Nashville Primary, that's opening this fall. Then we also wanted to increase member interaction with the state's legislators, and we've had several meetings with that as well. And then finally, we wanted to formalize a process for collecting our engagement data so that our members are getting credit for all the great work that they're doing with the stakeholders in our community. So we have had our members continue to engage with their constituents through the media. We've had several op-eds published. I believe Fielding and Allison both in the first half of the year had op-eds published, and I believe Bob has one that's scheduled to be published soon. We've been planning several days in the district. I know that we have one in talks with Roane County to have several of our members come for that, and I believe Hamblin County as well. We have an informal visit scheduled to KIPP Nashville Primary in late August, I believe, where our members will be able to meet with administrators and staff there. And I think we're working on getting some other ones scheduled as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have had a few more meetings with legislators and other district stakeholders. I know Mike Edwards has had several meetings where he's met with both district and EPP, educator preparation provider stakeholders throughout his district. And so we've had some good successes in the first half of this year, which leads us to the creation of the 2018-19 master plan. So again, moving forward, those will be aligned to the academic year. So to prepare for that master plan, we shared a survey with the board members in April, and we're able to get their feedback on everything and incorporate that into both the goals that we have as well as the specific priority areas that we're going to be focusing on. The staff incorporated that survey data into a draft that was again created in May, and then we sent out the draft to members for additional feedback in early June, and then that'll be up for you guys on final reading tomorrow. So any questions about what we've accomplished for the first half of the year or what we've got planned moving forward with the master plan?
Appreciate all the feedback on the 18-19 master plan that Ms. Spencer mentioned is up on first and final reading tomorrow. But any comments, thoughts,
Gordon?
reflections from last year?
I believe Gordon.
Just one question. I know yesterday evening I saw in the news that I think the results of the 2018 teachers or educators survey had been released. Do we glean any information from that, the outcome from that survey, and see if it lines up with anything we're doing here in a good way, or are there things that could be gleaned from that could be incorporated?
Absolutely. And Candace may want to jump into, I feel like that's been one of the most valuable sources of input that we've had as a state over the last few years. And I think particularly in this last round of data that was released just yesterday, there's a lot of things that this board will want to reflect on. So whether it's a future workshop or at our retreat, we'll make sure that we have that information sort of available and we can cross-reference that as we think about 18-19 and the 19-20 master plans.
Just a question on the high standards and quality achievement measures, the implementation checks. How was that order of, you starting with ELA and then math, how was that order set?
I'm happy to jump in. So
Yeah,
let me make sure I heard your question. I was writing down a note from Gordon. But in terms of the sequencing of the standards review, we initially, based on legislation, reviewed math, and Amy's going to do a presentation on this later today, math and English language arts together. And so what we've heard from the field and know just through work with districts, and you would know this, having two major subject areas at the same time being adopted, both in terms of the training and the rollout of textbooks and all the other materials, was really challenging for districts. So we're trying to decouple the 6-year cycle for math and English language arts, which meant sort of a check this year just on implementation, some very minor changes to the standards. We'll be doing a similar sort of implementation check on math, I believe, next year. So that's just an effort to kind of decouple those two.
That's what
Yep, those two subjects. More to come on that later this morning.
This may not be the right time to mention this, but I do want to thank Spencer for his service to the State Board of Education. He's been with us since 2015, and he's leaving us after tomorrow. Actually, he'll be leaving Sunday for New York to pursue his doctorate. He's done an incredible amount of work for us, and it's been interesting and fun to watch him grow in this position, and it's really very difficult to see him go because you've done a great body of work for us, and we're indebted to you and very thankful to your service. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is the 2018 legislative update from Mr. Nathan James.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Yeah, if you don't mind. Thank you so much. Good morning. As you know, this was quite a year for us at the General Assembly, and I'm going to try to get through this with some speed. It was a very positive year for us, but a year of tremendous engagement. We did get 100% of our legislative priorities passed. We certainly had some positive budget hearings. This was our heaviest load of legislation, budget improvements, and rule disputes for the State Board of Education in at least a decade. We had 9 bills of some fairly substantive legislation, 3 confirmations, and successful budget expansions, all in the interest of student safety. And we'll go through some of these bills. Public Chapter 539. This changed the term of the chair of the State Board of Education. As you know, when the State Board authorizing legislation was first created, your terms were 9 years and the chair's terms were 4 years. Now that your terms are 5 years each, it seemed appropriate to change the term of the chairman down to 2 years each. And so this, for us, will necessitate an election in January. Public Chapter 935 went through and clarified what were previously considered inherent powers of the State Board of Education that were at least implied in statute. That is to say, it was considered inherent that if we could revoke a license, we could also suspend a license or issue a reprimand. This was challenged in this last year, so it was made extremely clear by Public Chapter 935 that we also have the power to suspend a license and issue reprimands, specifically also for violations of the Teacher Code of Ethics. The other thing that this bill did specifically was it closed a loophole for directors of private schools who did not report educator license issues to the State Board of Education. Now, that was one of the highlighted issues that came out when USA Today shone a spotlight on the issue of teacher license, educator misconduct issues around the country. That was one of the highlighted areas, and that particular law dealt with that. Public Chapter 936 by Senator Gresham and Representative Reedy required the State Board of Education to develop a policy for transmittal of final disciplinary actions on educator licenses to the National Clearinghouse. That's the NASDAQ program. That's the National Clearinghouse of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification, and to post our information on the website. I'm pleased to say that by the time this bill came up in its first committee, the State Board staff was already completely compliant with this public chapter. That act took effect on the 15th of May. The next bill, Public Chapter 937, took the Teacher Code of Ethics and made it clear that the adherence of that was a requirement for everyone in the profession. And it took some amending as we went through. I'm pleased today that we are joined by some key legislative staffers who were in the room and worked with us on this process. Because as we go through year after year, it becomes more and more important to recognize the efforts of key legislative staff. And today I want to thank that in the back we've got Patrick. Patrick is with us from the House Education Committee, and I want to publicly thank you for all the help you've given the State Board of Education this year. So anyway, as it came out, this was turned into a much stronger bill with his help. This next bill, Public Chapter 1006, ended up requiring the state of Tennessee and LEAs to enter into the FBI RAP-BACK program. This requires criminal background checks for teachers, including non-conviction data. Sometimes a teacher would be arrested for something and we would never find out about it unless there was specifically a conviction. The RAP-BACK program, for those of you that aren't aware of it, is similar to what credit monitoring is for a credit service. But there are only 2 states in the union right now that are in the FBI RATBAC program. This legislation will have Tennessee become the 3rd state that is in the FBI RATBAC program, and will put all Tennessee educators into the FBI RATBAC program, so that we will become instantly aware when a teacher is arrested for a crime of moral turpitude. There was some question about who will bear the cost of it, and the way the legislature worked out the wording of it in the end, each of the LEAs will come up with their own specific policy, so they can determine whether or not they will bear the cost at the local level. Public Chapter 938 prohibits LEAs from entering into non-disclosure agreements as a prerequisite to settling a settlement for any act of sexual misconduct. We've run into cases in the past where districts errantly try to enter into non-disclosure agreements with teachers as really sort of a false agreement with them before they let them go, rather than terminating them. Our staff attorney has run into situations where districts are not as forthcoming as they ought to be. And so one of the things that the General Assembly wanted to make sure was specifically prohibited was any non-disclosure agreement between a teacher who was leaving employment and the district regarding the specifics of their departure from employment. As we go, certainly any questions that you have or any discussion you'd like to undertake, we certainly can. But I'm also want to make up some time. I know we're short on it. The next one, Public Chapter 697. This adds the funding for the standards review process that we had gone through a couple of years back. Last year, we got the authorizing legislation passed that covered the standards review process that we went through a couple of years back, but it was not funded in the executive budget. This year, the governor did fund it in the executive budget and made it a recurring line item. So it finally passed the House of Representatives and became law. So the standards review process that we went through previously will be how the Big Four, that is to say ELA, math, social studies, and science, will be dealt with from this point forward. Public Chapter 699 states that our Tennessee history course will begin in the 1819 school year. That was to make sure that it was aligned with the textbook process. And also for our purposes as an LEA, it was made clear to us by the federal government that we needed a specific law placed on the books that said, just in a few words, that the State Board of Education is an LEA. We remember we've also had some issues around our ability to issue rules about homebound instruction, because the law, up until this year with the passage of Public Chapter 625, said that our authority to issue homebound instruction rules were specifically limited to pregnant students. And so we partnered with the folks out at Vanderbilt and other concerned citizens and passed Public Chapter 625 to allow the State Board of Education to pass homebound rules in general. Public Chapter 744 was passed by Senator Harris and Representative Lawler. As many of you may know, and I know Darrell certainly knows, Representative Lawler passed away from a heart attack about a month ago now. He served both on education and on government operations, and the General Assembly is feeling his loss. One of the issues that each of you at different times has expressed concern about is our duty under the law to suspend educator licenses based on failure to repay student loans. That is to say, the TSAC suspensions. Representative Lawler and Senator Harris put together this Public Chapter 744, which allows for a medical hardship exemption, which has never existed before. So our staff and the staff of other boards and agencies are working together to determine exactly what those medical hardship regulations are going to look like. This next bill is one where we worked with the sponsors and with legislative staff and others. This Public Chapter 906 was about the teaching of firearms safety in public schools. And as the bill was originally written, it would have had you all creating a series of academic standards around firearms safety. And so we had that amended and took you out of the firearm safety business, and instead just Public Chapter 906 mirrors statutes that already largely exist that authorizes local districts to have firearm safety courses without the use of live ammunition in the classroom. So, but in the end, it leaves things largely as it was and won't put you in that particular situation. Public Chapter 654 transfers control of the Special Trust Fund for Education from the State Board of Education to the Treasurer. And Public Chapter 557 prevents educators or LEA staff from altering student transcripts. This comes out of a series of controversies in the Memphis area. So, in other words, there must be evidence that the student actually earned the grade reflected, and infractions there against that policy can result in licensure action up to revocation. And that's, of course, where we will get involved. Public Chapter 725 proves that the legislature is not just in the business of passing new laws, but also does pay attention to some of the clutter that is in Title 49, and in this case removed 12 different provisions related to the State Board of Education that were out of date. They removed numerous provisions related to the Department of Education as well, going through and mostly old pieces that simply just weren't called for anymore. The Public Chapter 844 by Senator Swan asked the BEP Review Committee to analyze the components for social workers to the BEP funding formula. Working with Chairman Hartgrove and some other legislators on the BEP Review Committee, that has been an issue that has come up for the last couple of years for the BEP Review Committee anyway, and that work is underway. The Public Chapter 698 moved the time to approve a sponsor's amended application from 30 to 60 days. That is some work that Tess on our team was able to work with the folks representing the large school districts, and wanted you all to be aware of the provisions of that act. One that is going to be of specific interest to this board and everything we do moving forward are the provisions of Public Chapter 929 by Senator Bell and Representative Matlock. We think of our work as being very specifically intersected by the education committees, and it certainly is. But our work is also very specifically intersected by the government operations committees of both the House and Senate. And Public Chapter 929 makes changes to the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act and specifically requires all government agencies to annually submit policies rather than only rules to the Government Operations Committee of the General Assembly. This is a massive change. I want to allay some concerns, though. The submission of policies to this committee does not mean that they will have the ability to set them aside. It doesn't mean that they are going to go through and approve them. It does mean on an annual basis that every policy that we pass, we will be submitting a copy of them to the Government Operations Committee along with a complete explanation thereof. So I spent some time this last weekend with the government operations staff attorneys and some of their staff, and they're still kind of looking at exactly what the process is going to look like for compliance with that portion of that public chapter. It further protects the freedom of speech for agency personnel of all agencies subject to sunset, which frankly is everything not laid out in the Constitution. So if it's not the Supreme Court or anything like that, it's virtually, it's all the state universities, it's all the executive branch agencies, it is the State Board of Education, it's very wide-reaching. It also clarifies that the appointing authority of a board, task force, et cetera, shall have authority to remove a member. This act took effect on the 1st of July, 2018. But our necessity to report on these policies will not effectively be required until the 1st of July next year. So with everything that we pass this year policy-wise, we will be submitting that to them next year. So like I say, this public chapter is very far-reaching. It's just something to keep in mind when you all pass a rule, pass a policy, that's something specifically that Elizabeth Taylor and I and Elizabeth Five-Ash, we spend a great deal of time in front of the Government Operations Committee talking about the decisions that you all make. So, let's see. The public chapter 881 is one that each of you have had a lot of time to discuss already. We certainly discussed it at our board meeting. This was relative to the TN Ready assessments, and it certainly each of you have had a lot of questions about it. You all have taken votes on it as early as the April meeting, but no discussion of related legislation would be complete without its inclusion there. Legislative confirmations. Certainly Lang Wiseman, Bob, Eby, and Daryl were all confirmed this year, and their confirmations were official as of 4/6/2018, and were all signed by the governor. It was very positive in that respect. At this moment in time, we do have the 8th Congressional District is vacant as our good friend Lang was called to serve on the University of Tennessee board, which was reconstructed. The budget hearings this year, I think, were pretty extraordinary. As you all know, the budget hearings serve as the main point of oversight for the General Assembly. They are a time when the committees can call out the actions of an executive branch agency. They can, we're simply there to answer their questions. It's a time when our budget is in their hands. Remember that the year started out with an OREA report about educator license discipline, about a USA Today story where there was a great deal of discussion about what Tennessee has done right and what Tennessee hadn't gotten quite right about the process of educator license discipline. So when we say an understanding of the importance of these discussions is essential, really that can't be understated. That having been said, we had 4 successful budget hearings. And instead of that scrutiny, and instead of those discussions yielding a great deal of punitive action, it instead went the other way. Our partners at the General Assembly recognized that you, as members of this board, are committed to student safety, that you all are about the business of making certain that our kids are in a safe environment, and that you are committed to the highest standards in the profession of education. They wanted, across the board, to make certain that we had the resources necessary. And so they, along with the administration, put together a package that will allow us to have an additional staff attorney to work on the business of educator license discipline. There was even some work on the Senate side to appropriate money to have a State Board of Education paralegal added to our budget as well. That's pretty unprecedented. I will tell you there were 2 agencies in all of state government that any legislative committee attempted to assist like that. So I would say these things went very well, especially when all of the discussion in the first couple of weeks around everything related to the state board was about the USA Today article about the OREA report. I think this went well. So, in general, new state funding to education is, again, another chapter in the administration's commitment and the General Assembly's commitment to increased funding in education. It totaled over $200 million new dollars. That's $55 million in new funding for teacher salaries. Since 2011, Governor Haslam and the General Assembly have partnered to improve the BEP formula by $1.5 billion. That is extraordinary. That kind of increase is pretty amazing all the way around. So the expenditure increases are, of course, they're in your packet. The BEP teacher compensation program at $55,124,000. BEP growth and inflation at $48,820,000. The BEP TCRS, this is the retirement dollars there. That's $22 million. The current year growth of $18 million there. The RTI positions, this $13.3 million. Frankly, this represents one of the priorities of the BEP Review Committee last year. And I would certainly chalk that up as a win for the BEP Review Committee. We've tried to stay out of the business of asking for the whole world, but instead asking for targeted growth, and it's been successful. It's been successful, and with that, we've been able to do, I think, some good things with the extraordinary commitment of this Department of Education, of this governor, and of this General Assembly. And that's an example of that. Priority school improvement grants at $10 million. Charter schools facilities funds, $6 million. Read to be ready, nearly $4.5 million. School safety, $30 million. There's a lot to be said there. I know the commissioner has a lot to say there. The BEP Review Committee has also been roped in on that process. Principal leadership, that's something that's each of you has had a great deal of conversation about, things that has been of great concern. $1.75 million, and the list goes on. I have a complete list of education legislation available for each and every member. If you have interest in it, I can send it to you electronically. I can certainly make printed copies available to you. I hope this was brief enough while still painting for you an accurate picture of what we went through this legislative session. Thank you, Madam Chair and members.
Thank you, Nathan. Wendy, I believe you have some questions.
Hi, Nathan. You know I have questions. So on slide 3, and I don't know if this is a question for you or for the commissioner, the Code of Ethics PD, and then the EPPs. I'm going to do all that. I'm going to try to do every acronym I can. The COE, no, the professional development, the EPP training, and then training teachers to report violations. What is the implementation of that going to look like? Where is that going to live as far as implementation? And is there a timeline yet? And because I ask this every time, how are we going to make sure it's happening?
PC 935, is that where you're?
Yeah,
937.
I'm sorry, 937, yep. The bottom of the
Elizabeth,
slide.
why don't you come up and talk about this? We actually had a debrief on all of these in our senior leadership team meeting this week, and Elizabeth and Christy talked a lot about all the implementation components as well, so I'll let Elizabeth come up and share.
Awesome, good morning.
We've been affectionately called the Dream Team by government operations yesterday, so.
I can see why.
It's better than the Bopsy twins,
Bopsy
which
twins, yeah.
have also been
Last year, that's right.
So for the Code of Ethics, in the educator prep rule that you all will be voting on tomorrow, we've added that provision to the requirements. And so the educator prep team is going to be working with all of the prep providers to make sure that they know that that is a new requirement going forward and that they're going to be looking for that in their monitoring. We've also been working with TSBA on the Code of Ethics training that will take place in the schools. And I believe they are putting together a model policy for school districts and how different ways that they can deliver that training. And Christy Ballard, our general counsel, has been working with them as well to make sure that the training touches all of the major points and the things that could potentially lead a teacher to lose their license if any of these items are violated. Was there another one that you?
I mean, I think I'll loop back into this because it's about how we ensure that it's happening and that it's quality. Is there any conversation about the professional development being uniform? Or are you just letting districts, hey, you have to do this, and then somehow checking in to make sure they're doing it in a quality way?
Right now, it is a district decision. That certainly looking at some sort of uniform training is definitely something we can look at. It's given the timeline of when the legislation passed and before next school year, it was probably too quick to try to develop or seek out a uniform training that we could push out to all districts. But we could definitely look at that going forward if that's something they're interested in. I know a lot of times they do come to us, and probably you all as well, to get feedback on what those types of trainings are, because you're right, we do want it to be quality. So that's definitely something we can look at.
And let's remember another provision of that law also that is going to require this to be dealt with in teacher preparation programs for the first time.
Right,
So,
right.
So
And
that's a big lick there too. So the other side of it is also, you know, I certainly heard some discussion amongst members, and I think there's a possibility that some of the contents of the Teachers Code of Conduct will be the subject of legislation next year. I imagine there will be some provisions that will end up being cleaned up there, because there's some of the language there that's potentially, you know, that certain members had mentioned they wanted to come back and take a look at. When this bill was first introduced, it had some crazy reporting provisions in it, which we got tightened up as well. So,
I mean, you know, as a lawyer, I have to do continuing legal education, just like teachers have to do PD. And I know that there is a wide variety of as far as quality goes, and a lot of lawyers go into that, and I'm sure a lot of teachers go into the PD. They got a lot going on. Sit in the back of the room, check out your box. And so for Code of Ethics, I want to make sure that we do whatever we can to make sure that they're actually benefiting from it, both at the EPP level and in the professional development level. So I would encourage the state to think about some sort of, I mean, the only way you can control quality, right, is if you actually create it and then have it as what they need to do. And I'll also point out, I had some folks doing some research on this stuff, and I believe it's Georgia. The state of Georgia does a test that the educators take. It's like 20 questions, and it gives scenarios and whether this would be a violation in their state or not. I think that looks to be really helpful, and it's something, you know, you could make that part of the requirement. Like, you go to the PD. I know when I went to traffic school, you have to take the traffic school test at the end and pass it to be able to get credit. So I would just encourage you guys to think about that. It is great that the legislature did this, but if it's just, you know, sit in the back of a room, check a box, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
I, of course, have a couple more on different ones. On slide 5, Public Chapter 1006, the wrap back. What two states were doing that before?
So Utah was one of them.
Ohio.
Yeah. No. Well, now Ohio has a law that they call wrap back, but they never got approval from the FBI, and so they call theirs the wrap back, but it's wrap back in Ohio. And so you could go into Indiana and do something, and Ohio wouldn't know about it, but they call it right back. So it's Utah and Texas, I think.
Okay.
I think.
And you mentioned that the law says the LEAs decide whether they pay.
What
happens
it
if they
says
don't pay?
is the LEAs will create a policy on it.
But on whether they pay, I mean, what's the other option? Who
then the
pays
teacher-
if their policy says we're not paying for this?
Then the teacher would pay.
Each teacher to have themselves put into the system.
Yep.
Okay. And then the final one, I had questions about the GovOps policy, the new policy
Yes, ma'am.
statute. So my understanding is for rules, GovOps actually votes for approval of the rule, but policies, they would only be just getting them? Is that the way this is?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if they didn't like the policy, there's nothing in this statute currently that would change the policy at all, or require us to change the policy?
Right, in the
Currently.
statute, right.
Right.
And the thing is, just to remember that, I mean, we see those folks every month, and they
Right.
ask us questions every month about everything going on. So it's, you know, there's it's one thing to have a statute that says they can do X, and there's another thing to realize that they see us all the time. They know what's going on. But that having been said, you know, the relationships there are generally pretty good, and, you know, and I think things are good there, but
Nathan, quick follow-up on that.
Yes,
Do we
ma'am.
know if we're submitting those annually or, you know, on a
Annually.
rolling basis?
So you know, in my conversations with staff there, it looks like it would be towards the tail end of June every year. We would be submitting a package of policies. So,
Well, they'll just see how hard we work, right?
yeah.
And in that statute, my last question, I think, for my own personal edification, the appointing authority can remove you from a board.
Yes, ma'am.
For our purposes, is that the governor?
Yes, ma'am.
Or is that the legislature that approves us? It's the
No,
governor.
but
So
the-
Governor Haslam would have to be like, I'm done with Wendy. Okay.
Well, or his successor in office, which is the interesting point about that is that you've got when the legislature originally created the board and gave 9-year terms, it was designed to kind of, you know, have it go through gubernatorial terms. But yes, that public chapter puts it squarely in the hands of whoever the appointing authority is. But it's not, in our case will be the governor, but there are several boards and commissions that have speakers appointees and for so on like that. So
So the transitions between speakers could make a difference, and interesting. Okay, those are all my, thank you.
First, let me thank you and the state board staff and the department staff. I mean, it looks like a very active and outstanding year, legislative year. But as we look into the new year coming, it's apparent that there's going to be many new committee members.
yes, sir.
What's the process? When are the committees set up, and what's the process that we go through that we get to meet and establish the relationships with them in the future?
So, and we will all certainly have and continue to have very active conversations on an individual basis. You each as individuals represent a massive amount of people. It's the average size of a congressional district in terms of people is 722,000, right? So there are going to be 30 new members of the House of Representatives, and that's a body of 99. All of the chairs and vice chairs in House Education, both committees, subcommittees, all of them are leaving. All of them are. It is unclear as to who the leadership of the House of Representatives, you know, the speakers, all of those things remain to be appointed. The structure of the committees on the for each body is up to its leadership once elected. And so that election doesn't take place until January next. And then they will go into a 2-week organizational session. Only at that point in time will we know who's going to serve on what committee and what the committee structure will even look like. So certainly as public officials in your areas, as people who are extremely involved in your communities, you know, it's very good to have all those conversations, and we'll certainly have those one-on-one. You know, each of us will talk, and we'll spend a lot of time out in each of your districts and being accessible to those people whom you speak for. Does that help you, sir? Okay.
Anyone else? Gordon?
Madam Chair, I've got a question, just more to educate myself, but it relates to the $30 million that was allocated for school safety. Certainly, I think the safety of our kids and teaching and other staff members is of utmost concern. I'm just curious, when we talk about that being based on statewide security and a risk assessment process, is there a designated timeline that schools and the districts are supposed to get that completed? And then do we think the $25 million in one-time funds, is that going to just get eaten up rather quickly, or?
Commissioner McQueen has been involved in that work, so I'll let her speak to.
Sure, I appreciate you asking about this. The $5 million was recurring, and then $25 million was non-recurring. Every single school, so 1,800 schools, are completing their risk assessments. Those are being led by teams of local law enforcement, Homeland Security, and certainly education folks that are involved at the district level. Over 90% of all those risk assessments are complete, so that's the good news. And we have over 68 or so percent of the emergency plans also complete, and all the pieces of that package that had to be complete before they actually request funds. So they use that assessment to then put forth, here's what I think I'm going to use those funds for. Once that happens, and they have through, I believe it's the first part of September to get all of that in, they can start spending it immediately. So we've gotten a few applicants that have completed everything, and they're starting to spend that money. I do know so far folks are prioritizing SROs, either in their local budget, or they're using this money to be a bridge until they can actually have more local funds for the SRO, or they're prioritizing pieces of security that they needed at the building. For instance, additional cameras, additional ways that they have entry points that are protected. So those seem to be priorities. Here in just a few weeks, we're going to publish a document that shows what seems to be the prioritized items, and we'll share that much more publicly. The governor will be putting out a press release here in just a few weeks that give a real comprehensive viewpoint of everything that has happened this summer. But it has been a very busy summer on this front because we wanted to go into the fall with schools already having completed a lot of the components of the safety assessment, already actually purchasing what they needed, having SROs in place. And I do believe, and I think my colleagues would agree, that there will be more conversation about funding on this topic going into this year. So I'm not sure this is the end of the funding source at this point.
Good, thank you. You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? I would be terribly remiss if I did not acknowledge the work that Nathan James has done on behalf of the State Board of Education, because clearly he's there day in and day out, making sure that the issues that are important to us are being addressed by the General Assembly. And so thank you so much, because it clearly was a very busy year for him. He kept me abreast. He's met with me and the head of the caucus for the House. And to Bob's point, it's critically important to be able to do that and have those conversations. And I think those that are staying will help us in that navigation. And certainly Nathan is a big advocate for that. And so thank you so much for what you do day in and day out.
Very kind. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Charter school updates. Tess Stovall.
Thank you. Good morning. I wanted to take an opportunity this morning to kind of update the board on our general charter school work, because I know this is a growing area of work for the board. It's a relatively new area depending on the buckets. And so I just want to take a moment to kind of build the foundation, knowing that we have some newer board members, but also some upcoming conversations for the board at upcoming meetings to lay that foundation. But before I move on, I just wanted to say to Gordon, I actually participated in the school security assessment for our authorized charter school over the summer. So I would be happy to talk offline with any of you about what that looked like. Yes, it was a very interesting process. So first, within the master plan, we have the strategic priority around high quality school options. And the board's work in this area really falls into three key buckets. And we're going to just talk very briefly about what those buckets are. So first, the board passes charter school rules and policies. Second, we serve as the appeal body for any application that is denied at the local level, both a new start application, a revocation appeal, as well as a non-renewal appeal. And lastly, the newest part of our work, but growing in time and significance of our work, is our work as a charter school authorizer. So first, let's just touch briefly on the charter school rule and policy work and the work that the staff does in that area to support you as a board. So first, we encourage the authorization of high-quality charter schools through the adoption of rules and policies on charter schools, as well as the most recent adoption on the establishment of the high-quality charter schools, charter authorizing standards. So first, we're going to monitor implementation of those authorizing standards. That's going to be done through the annual authorizer report to the Department of Education when authorizers report out on their adoption of the authorizing standards. And we'll also do that through our appeal process when we are analyzing the local district's alignment to the authorizing standards. Second, we engage with stakeholders when developing rules and policies. The most recent example is our authorizer fee rule, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And third, we want to serve as a resource and thought partner with authorizers across the state, both current authorizers, but districts who might become authorizers. We want to help them engage with the authorizing standards and be able to come to us if they have questions or feedback of things that we could improve. The next bucket of our work is our work on charter school appeals. We're going to dig into this more in a few slides, but this will be a major conversation that the board will have at the upcoming October meeting. So here the board is supporting the approval of high-quality charter schools by providing applicants who come through our process with a thorough and rigorous and fair application review that's aligned to high-quality standards. So first, anyone who applies through the board is going to go through a thorough and rigorous and transparent review process. Secondly, as I talked about earlier, we are going to review local district alignment to the quality standards that the board has passed when analyzing an appeal. And third, we are going to annually evaluate our own process to make sure, number one, it is aligned to national and state standards, and then if we see areas for improvement, we're going to make those changes. And the last bucket of our work, and as I mentioned, becoming the largest part of our work is our work as an authorizer of charter schools. So here, we are really focused on providing the schools that are authorized by the state board to be academically challenging, supported, and safe. And we are going to hold those schools to the highest possible academic, operational, and financial standards. So the work that the staff does to support the board in this area is, number one, we're going to annually review the academic, operational, and financial performance of the authorized charter school. It's a best practice that we not only are, as a board and a staff, are annually reviewing that process, but we're going to be communicating that to the school because they need to know very clearly where they are and with regard to their charter agreement. Secondly, we are going to ensure that the monitoring oversight that we do is streamlined and efficient. In Tennessee, as Nathan spoke about earlier, we do serve as the LEA. So a lot of our work resides in the monitoring and compliance area. But we also serve as the authorizer. And so we are constantly having conversations to make sure that anything we're asking for is not overly burdensome, is streamlined, and that we are really supporting our schools. And third, that we are going to annually and publicly report out on the performance of our portfolio and the usage of the authorizer fee. Although both of these are required in statute, it's also a best practice that we are sharing with the public, with the schools, with our stakeholders regarding the performance and also how we are utilizing our authorizer fee. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to preview what could be an upcoming conversation at our October board meeting. So annually, the board hears any New Start appeals that we receive at the October meeting. So I wanted to let you know kind of what the landscape is looking like statewide. So here's the timeline that applicants are moving through right now and that local districts are participating in. So first, letters of intent are due across the state by February 1st of every year. If an applicant does not submit a letter of intent, they are not able to submit the application. By April 1st, applicants have to submit an application to their local Board of Education. And at that point, districts have 90 days to review and vote on that initial application. If the application is denied by the local district, applicants then have an opportunity to review the application, amend it, and resubmit it to the district, in which they have to do that within 30 days. Districts who receive an amended application then have an additional 30 days to review the amended application and vote on that application. It is only at the point where a district has denied an amended application would the applicant have an opportunity to appeal to the state board. So statewide this year, there were 30 letters of intent submitted across 3 school districts. Those school districts are Metro Nashville Public Schools, Robertson County, and Shelby County. Compared to the 2017 school year, that's a slight decrease where we saw 37 letters of intent submitted. When it came to actual submissions of applications, we saw 20 applications submitted across those 3 districts, which is actually a small increase from last year. It is very typical to see a decrease between letters of intent and actual submitting of applications. At this point, all 20 applications have been denied by the local districts on their initial application. And where we are in timeline is that applicants are currently reviewing the feedback from the districts and deciding whether or not they are planning to submit an amended application. Districts will vote sometime in August on any amended applications that they receive, and we expect to receive any appeals by the end of August. So very briefly, what happens when we receive an appeal? So we have 3 key parts that goes into the executive director's recommendation to the board. The first is that we gather information from the LEA and say, please tell us everything that you reviewed and the information you took into consideration when making a decision on the appeal, so that the staff does an entire review of the record. Second, we do a de novo on the record review of the amended application. To do this, we recruit and build review committees made up of internal and external experts to review each application and interview the governing board of the proposed school. This work results in a review committee report that will be incorporated into the executive director's recommendation. And finally, we host a public hearing located in the district where the school would like to locate. This is an opportunity for both the local board and the sponsor to publicly share their feedback on the application. The district sharing why they deem the application not to be high quality and they denied it, and the sponsor sharing why they feel like their charter application should have been approved. And it also allows the public to comment on it as well. All 3 parts roll up into a recommendation to the state board from the executive director. At that point, the recommendation is only a recommendation. The board may choose to do what they approve or not approve the application. And the board's decision on an application really depends on whether or not the school is proposing to locate in a district that has a priority school. So let's take the case of Robertson County. Robertson County currently does not have a priority school on the current or preceding list. Therefore, if we were to receive an appeal from Robertson County, the board's decision would be either to affirm the district's decision to deny the application or to overturn the district's decision and remand it back to the district for approval. In that case, the local board would be the authorizer. In the situations such as Metro Nashville and Shelby County, where there are priority schools located in those districts, the board's decision, if it agrees with the local district, would be to affirm the district's decision to deny. If it deems an application high quality, the board's decision would be to authorize the school and potentially remain the authorizer of the school if the local district does not decide to bring the school back. So since 2014, when the board became an appellate authorizer, we increased our review process and adopted national authorizing standards. In 14 of 17 appeals, the board has affirmed the district's decision to deny the application. But in 3 cases, the board deemed the applications to be high quality and approved the application. This has resulted in the board being the authorizer of 3 schools. So we have 3 authorized charter schools, 1 currently in operation, 1 starting in about 2 weeks, and the other one slated to come online next year. So the first authorized charter school is Bluff City High School, located in Memphis, and I know many of you all attended the opening ceremony last year. In the school year 18-19, it's going to serve 9th and 10th grade, and it will be in grades 9 through 12 at full enrollment. KIPP Antioch College Prep Elementary is, as Spencer mentioned earlier, is opening this year with kindergarten. It will eventually serve K through 4, and it's located here in Nashville and operated by KIPP Nashville. And the third authorized charter school is slated to open in school year 19-20 and will serve grades 5 through 8 and is similarly operated by KIPP Nashville. At an upcoming board meeting, we will be able to share more regarding the portfolio of the board's charter schools in terms of performance of academic, operational, and financial standards. And we'd probably be looking to that first at a subcommittee meeting of the charter school subcommittee, and then later at the board meeting, either potentially in October or January. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Wendy.
I always get first. Okay, the 30-day to 60-day change, that was for the district, and that, yeah, if you go back to the timeline.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that starts next year.
That does. So it applies to applications that will be submitted after July 1, 2018.
Okay. So this timeline currently, so we vote in October,
Yes.
right? So if we approve a school in October, it is generally, unless they've decided otherwise, for the next academic year, correct? So 10 months later. So this will, I guess, shorten that opening timeline by 2 months.
That's correct. So next year, when this revised timeline is in place, the board will likely be hearing appeals in November, which I know that the proposal is to actually move the meeting to November.
Right.
So yes, this will shorten the timeline that applicants would have to open a school. If they're approved by the state board sometime in mid-November, that's just 30 days later that they would know and be ready to authorize.
Okay. And was that, the purpose of that statute was to give more time for the appeal process, for the district process? Was it
It was to give more time to the district process.
Okay.
Understanding that districts have 30 days to review the amended application and vote on it. Districts felt like that was too short of a time to do a thorough review.
Okay.
I will say, I mean, we've had conversations, and again, it would be another statutory change, but we may need to look at the totality of the timeline and back up sort of the submission initially. I think, while I think it's true that particularly if you're Shelby County or, sometimes Metro Nashville where you get a ton of applications, you might need that additional time. That makes sense. I think we may need to look comprehensively, though, at the timeline.
And then the quality authorizing standards, you talked about how the statute, the High Quality Charters Act that was passed this last session, anyway.
2017, yes.
Was passed.
Yes.
Requires districts to adopt quality authorizing standards, which we already had in law.
Yes.
But what happens if they don't?
So what we will do on the appeal process is that we would note it in the executive director's report if there was misalignment with the authorizing standards.
What if it's a district that the school doesn't appeal?
I mean, I think that is an area of the law that is not addressed in terms of if a district is not adhering to the authorizing standards, there is at this point no clear remedy of what would happen. Certainly, I think if it came to us or if in conversations we were made aware of it, we would have a conversation with the district about it. And again, we want to be a thought partner here.
Right.
And we recognize too that the quality authorizing standards are comprehensive and we want to be thoughtful. We want to help districts who may be thinking about being a charter authorizer. We want them to realize that they too can get into the charter authorizing game and we can help them get there. But certainly that's an area that is not explained in the law of what is the remedy if there's a flagrant disregard.
So is there any, and I'm going to assume, hope for the best, hope for the best, prepare for the worst scenario. So a lot of districts are not interested in being a charter authorizer, as you know, and they go in it kicking and screaming. And I know in the past we've had appeals that came from districts where they clearly had not, and it was before they were required to be fair, clearly were not using quality standards. Like, they're like, the principals of the schools that the kids would be would potentially leave were on the committees, and that sort of stuff. So I guess my question is there anywhere, given the law as it is, without teeth to this, is there anywhere in rule or policy where we can give teeth to the requirement for quality authorizing standards, or is that going to require a legislative change? And that may be a Nathan question.
Probably Nathan and Elizabeth collectively. We have not seen a place that gives us opportunity to put additional teeth where the law doesn't allow it currently. But again, I don't know where Nathan and Elizabeth, do you have further comment on that?
Good morning. It took 2 whole hours for her to have to come up here and answer my question.
No, we're only an hour in.
Oh, an hour, see? Never mind.
I would agree with what Sarah said. Without the statutory authority to take some action against a district for not complying with the quality authorizing standards, I don't think that we have the authority to issue any punishment or anything like that to a district. So it would take a legislative change.
And it's, I'll say this about, and this is just to be aware of kind of the difference this next year between any year we've had in the last few at least, is it is very, very difficult to know now what the world is going to look like this next year. So, just to tamp down any expectations that we're going to be able to change the law much this year at all.
Nathan.
I mean, it's possible, but with a third of the House changing over, there are so many variables out there that we can have a wish list, but I would say whatever our wish list turns out to be, it ought to be at least a 2-year wish list.
Okay, I'm patient. Not really, but okay. So, and I want to point out just another difference, another change from last year to this year is that charters will now be paying an authorizer fee, right? Up to $35,000 each. So like in Metro Nashville, Metro Nashville will get basically $1 million to be a charter authorizer, right? So, I mean, I think there's some space in there. If you're thinking about getting money to be an authorizer, then you ought to be a quality authorizer, and we can have a 2-year
About
plan.
that as our next topic.
Yes, I know. I was leading in because I have a bunch of questions
Good
there.
segue.
Too. Excellent.
Did you have anything else?
Not yet.
Daryl?
Just want to make sure I'm clear on sort of the geographic distribution of charters throughout the state. Any information you can share on that?
Yeah, so we have approximately 111. If Marcy wants to correct my language, she can. But the vast majority of our charter schools in Tennessee are located in both Shelby County and Metro Nashville, with Metro having around 30, and then between Shelby County and the ASD having around 80. We do have a small portion of charter schools in Hamilton County, as well as one charter school in Knoxville. So for the vast majority are located in the large urban areas. I think annually we are seeing letters of intent being submitted to non-authorizing districts. I think this year Robertson County is a great example. Last year we saw letters of intent being submitted to districts in East Tennessee. We haven't seen successful applications yet, but I think you're just, from a trends perspective, you're seeing letters of intent being submitted beyond the urban cores.
So theoretically, when we're talking about districts as it relates to charters, we're really talking about 2 or 3 or 4?
In terms of currently authorizing districts, you're talking about 4 districts. Right. But certainly any district could be an authorizer and, be prepared to review an application. And I think that's something that we, in coordination with the Department of Education, anytime that we see a district who's received a letter of intent who is not currently an authorizer, we reach out to them, make sure that they are prepared for the application review process, have access to the authorizing standards, and just to provide support, because we know that it can be an intimidating process if you've never participated in it before.
And this year, do we expect a barrage of appeals, or what's your intuition?
How about this? I am a planner. I like my plan for my plan, Daryl, and I'm planning for the worst case scenario. But I'm always surprised. You just never know.
Are we staffed and equipped to manage that?
Yes, we have. I've recruited 15 external review committee members, which is the largest review committee external reviewers we've ever had. Again, we just want to be prepared. And the best case scenario is I say to review committee members, we ended up not receiving appeals. We don't need you this year, but certainly don't want to get to the end of August and be scrambling.
I can assure you Tess is prepared. We have a plan.
Yes, Bob.
I'm sure you're well planned and well ready for it, and it looks like it's going to be very active. Here's my question. Are we going to take this up in the retreat, or is there some sessions that we're going to have? Do all the board members know what our responsibility as an LEA is to run these schools? As a question.
It's a great question. We are going to take that up at future workshops and retreats to make sure that you really fully understand, because it is an evolving body of work. It's something we take very seriously. I think it's our chance to set sort of a model for what authorizing really looks like. So yes, is the short answer.
Okay, thank you all. You're up again for
Yes.
the authorizer fee for charters.
And I'm going to invite colleagues from the Department of Education who are going to join me for this presentation. So in 2017, as Wendy mentioned, the High Quality Charter Schools Act was passed by the General Assembly, which allows local boards of education to collect an authorizer fee beginning in the 2018-19 school year, which is coming up very quickly. In April, the board passed on first reading the authorizer fee rule and also called for a rulemaking hearing. So the purpose of this presentation is to walk you through that rulemaking process, and the changes that have been made. And also, the department is going to discuss the guidance document that they're drafting, which is going to accompany the rule. The document that's being handed out is the draft process document. You received it as a part of the workshop materials, but we also thought it would be helpful for you to have it in front of you as well. So first, we held a rulemaking hearing on June 26th here in Nashville. As a part of that rulemaking hearing, we accepted both written and oral feedback. From a written feedback perspective, we had one district, one stakeholder group, and one charter operator provide us written feedback. And we had representatives of 5 charter schools provide oral feedback at the hearing. The changes that were made from the rule, and based on all of this feedback, the State Board and the Department of Education collaborated to evaluate the language of the rule and make changes that is presented to you all on final reading. First, you'll see that the word receive in Section 1 has been changed to the word collect to align it with the statutory language. We recognize that the statutory language stated that authorizers would collect the authorizer fee, and therefore we wanted to ensure that the rule language aligned to the wording of the statute. In Section 3, you'll see that it states that the charter operators will pay the authorizing LEA in accordance with the payment process that is established by the Department of Education. Based on feedback, we also made some changes to the allowable expenses that the authorizer fee could go to. First, we added that legal fees to support LEA authorizing obligations would be an allowable expense. We recognize that some of our smaller districts may not have an in-house counsel and may actually contract out for a lot of their legal services, and so we wanted to allow that as well. We also added that the reporting of student directory information was an allowable expense. In Section 9, we specified that the LEA budget for the authorizer fee should be made available upon request. Sections 10 and 11 further clarified that the department would develop a process for reallocating any excess or misallocated funds back to the authorized charter schools. And Section 10 was added that the department would develop a process for LEAs to receive any past due authorizer fee amount from their charter schools.
The statute provides the department with the authority to develop guidance and processes for the charter school funding and authorizer fee payments. So we have been working on a guidance document to implement the authorizer fee rule. The authorizer fee payment guidance really is focused on timelines, invoicing and payments, any adjustments that need to be made between the LEAs and charter schools, further guidance on allowable expenses, and the redistribution of excess unspent funds and misallocated funds. So for the authorizer fee determinations, the amount that each school will pay each year will be based on the current year adjusted ADM count that is provided in October. Each charter school will pay the authorizer fee in 2 installments. The first one will be, they will receive their invoice after that October count, and then the second one will be in February. Any excess unspent funds must be identified in the annual authorizer fee report that each authorizing LEA submits to the department by December 1st. And the unspent funds will be distributed in a proportionate share to all of the LEA's charter schools. And those funds will be then adjusted in each school's February invoice. And then for misallocated funds, if the department determines that an LEA has misallocated its authorizer fee funds, we will withhold an amount equal to the misallocated funds in the following fiscal year and then distribute a proportionate share to all of the charter schools in the LEA. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Wendy?
I love the way okay, so for the benefit of the board members who aren't on the charter subcommittee and who are new, I know Elisa and, there we are, yes. The 3 of us are that subcommittee, and there was a lot of conversation with you guys at that about the concern, the sort of balancing of districts needing funds to be able to successfully help their charter schools succeed, but also charter school concerns that the money be used in a way that best benefits students, because all of this money is coming out of their student dollars. Like every dollar that goes to the district out of this is coming out of the classroom from a charter school. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on that so that my questions make a little bit of sense. My first question or concern is on, and I think I raised this at the subcommittee, but I want to raise it again because it's still here. The section 5, the authorizing obligations that you can use the funds for, A and C, my concern is that the legislature, the same year, I think it was the same year, that they passed the authorizer fee, increased significantly the application fee. So anybody applying to have to open a charter now pays $2,500 per school, right? And my concern is why then the district will be allowed to use that money, which is allocated for the approval process, and then still be able to use authorizer fee funds for that same approval process. Seems like they're able to sort of justify spending more money.
I'm happy to talk to that.
Yep.
I'm Marcy Tidwell,
Hi, Marcy.
Director of School Choice. I think the thought here, and I don't know that I was able to attend that most recent workshop that you all had, but the thought here in including that was to be able to allow authorizers to spend authorizer fee funds should they go over and above the amount that they've collected for those 2,500 application fees. So this would be first, the expectation would be that they would use those application fees first, and then should they go above that, that they would be able to use authorizer fees to utilize that as well.
Okay, and that makes sense, actually, and I wondered if that was it, but I mean, I think the legislature came up with that fee thinking this is how much it should cost, but even if they do go above, and I know we're requiring high-quality authorizing standards, and sometimes people take more money to do that, I don't know, I would ask, and I can come up with language before tomorrow, that is clear here, that there has to be some sort of statement or proof or something that they have actually exhausted the $2,500 fee per school. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to come up with something before tomorrow morning.
And I think there's a way for us to do that as well in the expense reporting.
Yeah, but I'd love to see it in the rule because then I know it's going to happen.
Okay. I mean, but I'm just, I think too, I would want to see on an expense reporting
Right.
an explanation that if we are seeing costs above and beyond that are for the application review process,
Yep.
to explain why you went above the $2,500.
Yep, and I think, and that actually leads into my next set of questions is, I'm trying to figure out what it looks like, and I want to say I want to give a little bit of a shout out. I have some fellows who worked this summer on looking at like best practices across the country, so I have a little bit of extra help here, and some of them are here in the room, but, and they'll be here tomorrow. But so I'm not like smart enough to have come up with a lot of this on my own. I just want to give them credit where credit's due. But so trying to figure out what it looks like, the reporting. So it looks to me like the LEAs just tell how much they spent in like large categories, right? And different states do this in different ways. Some states have these like personnel, non-personnel, other. Some states have very specific categories, and I would like to see us in the specific category range, and I would like to see this reporting disaggregated by school.
So yeah, yesterday Tess and I both presented a conference for the Tennessee Charter School Center, and were able to collect feedback from some folks who were in the audience, and that recommendation was made as well. It's not something we had heard up to now, but we are still in the process of creating what will be a template for authorizers to report back to us, and we think so far it's pretty thorough in terms of authorizers being required to indicate exact expenses, what those expenses were, very specifically detailed descriptions about what the expenses were for, how those expenses align with each of the high-quality charter authorizing standards, but then also, in addition, adding a column for which schools were affected.
Okay.
I made this point yesterday, and I'm happy to say it again. I think the only risk in that is if then charters want to go back and say, well, I don't see my school, because I think often a lot of the expenses will be all schools. This would really affect all of our charters. And if they can't really calculate that their expenses added up to $35,000, we just don't want to put that out there as a possibility that a school might say, well, we're not paying you the full 35 because we don't see that you've spent that much on our school.
Right, and I
So-
can see that, and I mean, they have to pay it by law, but I would say that that's exactly what transparency is, right? If
right.
I'm KIPP Nashville, I'm not picking on KIPP, but KIPP has a
Right.
lot of numbers, and I go in and I say, I paid you, a lot more than 35,000 because they have a lot more schools, and I don't see bang for my buck, then that's a conversation they should be able to have. Like, what are you doing
Certainly.
for me? So I love the idea of that for that exact, the reason that you're concerned about it is the reason I like it.
Well, and I think too, we recognize that there are some years that an authorizer may have to spend more time with a certain subset of schools because there's an intervention plan, and I think we can look at how is the wording so it's clear that the reason this was so much was spent here was because there were extenuating circumstances that we would want an authorizer intervening on.
Right, and I think all of that comes with that transparency. So, and I'm not gonna, you're just gonna have to stop me at some point. So,
We're good on time right now.
okay, excellent. And then at some point, and I think we may need to see what this looks like a year or so. So, and I know we can always change rules, but at some point, I would like to have a conversation once we see that transparency about disaggregating or like by charter school the reimbursements if districts ever figure out how not to spend the money, which I don't think is going to happen. But if there is reimbursement money, being able to use that transparency to figure out if KIPP Nashville paid, $500,000, I'm not doing the math, and there is an amount that needs to be reimbursed, be able to look and get money back based on something other than just dividing it evenly. That concerns me because some people are going to be paying for everybody else at that point. I'm not talking about now, I'm just saying in the future.
I think that's exactly our intent already,
Because it says here, it says here, I thought it said in the guidance document that it would be, it says proportionate share. Okay. All right, that's great. Thank you. I was reading it as equal share, and that's not what you meant. A couple other. The LEA budget made available to charters upon request. So I don't know of any charter that isn't going to want to see how you're spending the money that should be in their classroom, in their minds. So I would like to see that change to, instead of upon request, that the budget is made available and have some kind of timeline there. I mean, I don't know of a reason why the LEA shouldn't be telling the schools, this is what we're spending your money on, right? Looking at the table, you're looking at me blankly.
I mean, I guess I would be curious as to if they have to do it upon request, why that's not sufficient.
Well, because why should the charter have to ask for a copy of the budget of the money that they're sending? Why can't there be why can't it be in the rule that when the LEA decides how they're going to spend your money, they tell you how they're going to spend your money? That's how the best practice is in Louisiana and in a couple of the other states that we looked at. It actually, in those states, it's 30 days before you tell them how you're going to spend it, and then 90 days after you give them a full allocation of how you spent it. So I'm trying to find a middle ground here, but I do think that charters should be given the budget of their money without having to ask for it.
I think where we are trying to strike this middle ground here is wanting to give districts to create the transparency, but also understanding that if the district submits a budget or presents a budget and then the expenses are different,
right?
That is allowable. And what is
right.
and so how we don't want to necessarily we want the transparency of the budget, but also not holding them to the exact penny of the budget, knowing that the school year dynamics may change and that things may change. And so I think if we have it, I think when we were striking this language, figuring out how do we create that transparency that districts want, but not then putting like the department in the place of kind of being the mediator on the front end when we don't really know how this is all going to play out. I think we all acknowledge that, as you said, this first year, we're going to learn a lot. And I think what we would want to hear is that if schools are not getting this budget, then we need to know about it so that we can come back and change the rule.
Right, and I appreciate that, but nothing about whether the budget changes or not changes whether they should get it without having to request it. So, I mean, I'd love feedback. I want to request a change of this language, which we can have this conversation. I want feedback on it. But I want to ask the board, and when we vote on this tomorrow, to get rid of this upon request and come up with like when they need to give it. So I would love feedback on what you guys think like would make sense for when they give it. I see that for fiscal years end in July, right? For
yes,
districts.
Well, yeah, June 30th.
Or June 30th. So July 1 is the beginning of a fiscal year, and I see they already have to give the reports to the department, like by December 1st, right? For the next year.
Right.
So 4 months after the year ends, they're giving, right? How they spent it, like
On the back end.
post spending.
Yes.
It's 4
Yes.
months after the budget closes. They've got 4 months to figure out how to document that in the way that you guys ask and send it. So that part there's a timeline for that. But I think the charters have a right to know how the money is anticipated to be spent some point before it's spent.
I think I'm gonna bring Elizabeth Taylor up again. Sorry, Elizabeth. I think we have to be thoughtful that is not requirement is not outlined in statute, and so whether or not she would have concerns about putting it in a rule, kind of expanding the authority.
I'm pulling up this. I have the statute here because I read through it.
So Wendy, while they're pulling up the statute for me, what language would you propose to put in the rule? I know you don't have it exactly as you'd like to have it in the rule, but if I got an idea of what you would be proposing, that would help.
So on number 9, wait, is that, yeah, it's number 9, it's not a sub. Okay. The LEA budget for the use of the authorizer fee shall be made available to its authorized public charter schools. And then I want to remove upon request and have some language there. And I get, I can put on my lawyer hat and look at this, and it doesn't say that they have to do it within a certain time. It doesn't say they have to do it at all, actually, but it does say that we're allowed to promulgate the rules and develop a process. So I think that would fall into the process.
Yes, I mean, I think if we're taking out upon request and adding a time certain to that, then I don't think it would make a difference statutorily.
Right.
Upon request versus setting a time frame, I think both would be within our authority.
Okay. Back to it. Okay, and we don't have to, I mean, we don't have to have this here, but I would love some feedback tests on what that time frame ideally could look like while balancing all of
Yes.
these. And again, I mean, if they can, right now, when do they request it? Like, it's not even clear when the budget would be available here. It's just really murky to me. So I'm just trying to clear that up and make sure schools know, this is when I can see how you're going to spend my money, or how you anticipate spending my money. Like,
And I think too, I think a thought, and we can discuss offline and we can discuss more. I think the question is that turned into the Department of Education? Is that just made available on a website? I think those are some implementation
clear that
questions that
too.
we'll just need to talk through around how disaggregated is that, that I think we would need to discuss and kind of come up with some potential language that we
So,
because that, I'm sorry.
No,
I was going to
you
say,
go ahead.
all of that is unclear here too. Like, that's not clear yet. All it says is right now is upon request, so you don't know what it looks like, how disaggregated it is. So all I'm trying to do is make it like where everybody knows what the requirement is and when.
let's take a pause for a second. I want to see if anybody else has any questions
my
or
last
comments. And then I was going to turn it back to Wendy for additional. You're good? Okay. Anybody else?
Those are my scribbles.
Okay, great
I
discussion.
will say, I mean, it'll be very important for this rule to pass at this meeting, just for the timeline of implementation for this current year. So whatever changes we decide to make, and staff, we can kind of confer to and make sure that we're tight with the language, so that, you know, because it is a rule, not a policy, I want to make sure that it's really ready for the next stages of
Yes,
promulgation.
I think where we land, and I know, Wendy, you feel the same way, you know, we know that school starts next month.
Right.
We want to give districts and operators very clear guidelines of how this process is going to work, because we recognize there's anxiety on all sides.
Yep.
So we can discuss further and see what we can pull together.
Yep, and I think we're all, I mean, we're all
Yeah.
coming from the same place,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Well, clearly you all have worked very hard to strike that appropriate balance. And Wendy, your points are well taken. So then we'll hear what you all have to share with us tomorrow, what your recommendations are. We're going to take a 5-minute break, 5 minute, and come back and convene right after that. Thank you all. We are ready to reconvene and
I think it's snack time for me over here.
I have a breakfast bar.
Oh, I can
I think we're just,
It's just in my bag.
I think all of the board members are back.
This morning and I ate one. Okay.
I came
I
prepared.
do that when I'm not pregnant, so I'm ready. Snacky kind of gal.
Me too.
I think we're just missing Candace.
I just saw
Welcome to the board.
Well, since it's Amy, do you think there's any?
There you go.
We are ready to get started with the next agenda item, English Language Art Standards Implementation Checklist. Ms. Amy Owen.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members.
morning.
Excited to be here talking with you about ELA standards this morning. I'm joined by Lauren Bardwell, the Executive Director of Adolescent Literacy at the Department of Education. She's going to be taking over the slides later in the presentation when we get into specific changes.
We have reconvened this meeting. Excuse me.
We're going to get started.
Can you hear me in the back of the room? This meeting has reconvened.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one more time, I'm joined by Lauren Bardwell, the Executive Director of Adolescent Literacy at the Department of Education. And Lauren will be taking the slides later in the presentation that get into specific clarifications and tweaks that we're recommending to the English Language Arts standards as a result of this implementation check. So she's your content area expert. I'm going to walk y'all through the process of the implementation check. So a little bit of context. As you all remember, especially folks who were on the board a few years ago, the state board is charged with reviewing all academic standards on a 6-year cycle. And usually it's very split out for the main content areas, ELA 1 year, math the next, science, social studies, and so forth. However, beginning in October 2014, the governor actually charged the state board with conducting a thorough review of the English language arts and math standards, and that was then also added into state law. This was as we were transitioning away from the Common Core state assessments and to Tennessee-specific academic standards. We had an unprecedented period of public feedback. There were over 100,000 public comments submitted on individual standards, and we had dozens of Tennessee educators at the K-12 and higher education levels involved in reviewing and revising those standards, and then a standards recommendation committee charged with approving them before they were offered to the board for a vote. Those standards were adopted on final reading in October 2016 and were first implemented in classrooms this past fall in the 2017-18 school year. That review process that concluded in 2016 was exemplary for the level of stakeholder involvement it generated and the work of our Tennessee educators who developed the standards. However, schools and districts experienced several consequences as a result of having the ELA and math standards reviewed at the same time and ahead of the regular 6-year review cycle. So several of these challenges were that educators did not have state-reviewed materials aligned to the revised standards in this first year of implementation because that review of standards happened off-cycle with the regular 6-year textbook review. And Gordon, you made a wise comment earlier about looking at results of the Tennessee Educator Survey. That just came out yesterday, and one of the results was that while 9 out of 10 educators said they understand what the state standards expect of them as a teacher, 6 out of 10 felt that the materials they had available were well suited to their teaching. So 4 out of 10 did not think that. So it's clear that this lack of aligned instructional materials poses a challenge. In addition, districts had to train educators on revised standards in 2 major content areas at the same time. And I'll tell you, I was working at the Department of Education on the training team at this time. We had money from the General Assembly, the state was all on board, districts were on board, everybody was trying as hard as they could to get ready to implement these revised standards, but it was still a big lift, especially in your smaller school districts where you don't necessarily have an ELA coordinator and a math coordinator. Sometimes that person was wearing the same hats and probably also coordinating, school busing or something like that. And in addition, for our elementary teachers, they're teaching both of these subjects, and so to have them at the same time was a real challenge. So what we wanted to do is get the ELA and math standards back on their regular 6-year review cycles, decoupled from each other, as Sarah said earlier, and back aligned with textbook review. So what we did in 2018 is conduct what we called an implementation check of the ELA standards. So in the first year of having these standards in the classroom, what concerns were educators having? What was unclear? And what were our department colleagues who were charged with supporting implementation hearing from districts? What were their common questions? So the things we wanted answered here were, what's working well in the field? Where is the phrasing of standards maybe unclear? How can we address common implementation concerns or questions through better wording or more examples, better defined terms, that kind of thing? The staff worked with a small team of the original standards writers to incorporate educator and community feedback on the ELA standards as part of this implementation check. The revisions and clarifications presented tomorrow will be up for final reading in October, and if adopted, these ELA standards will reset the 6-year review cycle for English language arts. The timeline for this implementation check was that this past winter, the State Board hosted an online survey for the public to provide feedback. We had comments primarily from educators, but also from parents and other community members. The State Board staff aggregated that data and added in concerns from Lauren's team and from the training team at the department of questions that the department commonly got from districts and teachers. In March, our team of Tennessee ELA educators met in person to consider all that feedback. They took it very seriously, that folks were giving their time and effort to comment on these standards. And then that team worked virtually throughout the spring to propose the revisions that are going to be before you tomorrow. I'd like to thank both Lauren, Fong, and Sandy on the department team. And I'd also like to say how grateful we are to our educator reviewers and quickly share their names and districts. The leaders of the review process were Shannon Jackson from Knox County and Melanie Maxwell from Lipscomb University. The elementary reviewers were Carrie Newsom from Dyersburg City Schools and Tony Dalton from Hamblin County Schools. Middle school reviewers were Shannon Street from Cannon County, Tequila Cornelius from Franklin Special School District. And the high school reviewers were Brandy Blackley and Elaine Hoffert, both of Clarksville Montgomery County Schools. So we really appreciate them. After the meeting tomorrow, the public may continue to provide feedback on the standards as the board sees them on first reading by emailing their comments to tnstandards.review@tn.gov. And we'll be sure that we communicate that out both through our own communications messages, or we have our own board newsletter, as well as the department listservs and social media, that kind of thing. We will continue to take those public comments, review them, and consider ways to incorporate them into the standards before final reading in October. And if approved, those standards would then be implemented in classrooms in the 2020-2021 school year, which seems a little ways out, but I'm sure we'll be here before we know it. And at that time, districts will also have new standards-aligned textbooks and instructional materials to support standards implementation. And as a final note, to kind of close out this cycle, we'll complete an implementation check for math, with final reading coming in July 2019 to fully reset the review cycle and get them back on board with textbook adoption as well. Really quick overview before I turn it over to Lauren. As y'all probably saw as you were reviewing these standards, we want to be really clear that this is not another wholesale change of standards, right? We just had our first year of implementing the English language arts standards. the last thing we want folks to be concerned about is, oh my goodness, the state board's changing ELA standards again. That's not the point. The point is to be responsive to the concerns that we've heard from districts and teachers, both in terms of the timing of the review itself, as well as some clarifications or some minor revisions to the standards to help improve implementation. So I can't say that clearly enough. This is in response to educator and district concerns, and it's not at a large scale. So as an overview, we do have clarifications regarding specific standards. The reviewers, based on public feedback and based on common questions the department had received, recommended changes to several specific standards. Grammar and formatting changes, you can look at a 100-odd page document 16 times, and on that 17th time, you're still going to catch a comma that's missing or an extra space, so some of those kinds of things. Refinements and additions to some of the glossary definitions. And in addition, what our standards reviewers did is they improved the formatting of the permanent high school elective courses, which are things like journalism and creative writing, to align the coding of those standards, so just not the wording, but how they're coded, to align with how the standards are coded in all the other subject areas, and to provide some introductory text about the purpose of each of those courses. So with that, as kind of the process overview, I'll turn it over to Lauren to look at specific changes, and then we're both happy to take questions afterward.
And I just want to reiterate what Amy said. These are not major changes to the standards. If they were, my team would have major concerns in the field about having to retrain again on the standards. They are very minor in scope. And as we looked at the public feedback, actually it wasn't even half of the comments were about changes to the language of the standard. There were several categories. Some were, I don't have materials aligned to the standards. Other categories were, I don't understand what the standard means, where it's not a clarity issue, but just more professional development on that standard. So there were more changes made to the appendices than there were to actual changes in the standard language themselves. And so when we look at specific language changes in the foundational skills, there was very few. We added some language to give more specificity and then added some substandards. I will say some of the feedback from the field was that some of the standards were not developmentally appropriate, but I do think that's more of a result of raising expectations takes time, and we still have several members in the field who are struggling with this because before we wanted all of our students to experience success, and we still do, but as we raise expectations, there's going to be struggle. And so our standard review committee looked at those comments very seriously, but ultimately determined that they would not change that wording based on the developmental inappropriateness, so to say, of that standard. We also have a language strand in our standard, and this one probably had the most changes, but they are, again, minor. The hyphen, a punctuation mark, was accidentally left out the last time. It seems so minor, but actually, if a student can demonstrate the correct use of the hyphen, it showcases a very savvy writer. So we added the hyphen back in, and then based on feedback from the field that thought some punctuation marks or usage, elements of usage were maybe not appropriate for that grade level, they did a little shuffling around of this will now be introduced in 6th grade versus 8th grade, but very minor in language. They added an appendix specifically addressing the language strand because as you progress in the grade levels, there are actually fewer language standards. The wording is much more broad. And we became very aware that the high school teachers didn't necessarily think that they were responsible for reinforcing the earlier grade standards. For example, subject-verb agreement is introduced at grade 3. But as a former high school English teacher, I know that my students still struggle with subject-verb agreement as the sentences become longer and more complex. I have a student over here smiling. So it is still the responsibility of the high school English teacher to reinforce that standard in his or her classroom. So we added a language progression chart to show what standards need to be reinforced as you go up through the grade levels. We also have the reading strand, and there were minor edits here, but they were actually very important because these represent the majority of what we see or what we receive from the field. One was that up until grade 5, I believe, the standard 2 used the phrase main idea, And then in in grade 6, it became Central Idea, which caused a lot of confusion out in the field, really for no reason, because they're the same exact thing. And that was a question I and my team were constantly responding to through emails. So we decided with the review committee that we will use the term Central Idea in all grade levels so that it's crystal clear what we mean by that. We also added words such as mood and perspective to, again, provide more guidance. And one of our standards specifically referred to historical texts. And if we kept it that way, then it implied that students should not be reading contemporary texts in that classroom, so just clarifying a little bit of language there. No revisions were made to the speaking and listening standards. In fact, I don't think we had any public comments on those standards themselves. And in the writing standards, we made a change based on how we've looked at writing over the past few years, where we really loved that idea of, oh, they'll always write in a formal style, which means never use the pronoun I. But actually, that's not how professional writing is, so we've changed the formal style to a style that's appropriate to the task and the audience, because we want our students to be fluid writers who can adjust their language no matter what audience they're writing for. So as you can see, the changes to the standards themselves were minor. We added much more information to the appendices to give more context on what we mean when we say perspective, what do we mean when we say Central Idea, and things like that.
Thank you so much. Y'all can tell why I'm so glad to have Lauren as the content expert up here. Just as to close us out, we will be happy to take more public comment on these standards through September 15th. And that deadline is just to give our staff some time to go through all of the comments, to confer with our educator review committee members before the October meeting. So educators, parents, and the general public are welcome to provide further input on the ELA standards by emailing the address we have up here on the screen, and we'll make sure that we do our part to share it out via our typical communication channels. I know the department has several listservs that go to all teachers and directors of schools and so forth, and we have our own newsletters and social media as well. So with that, we're happy to take questions on this process or on specific changes.
Bob?
First, I'm not an educator, but I was looking at the reading standard, and this was on integration of knowledge and ideas, and the cornerstone: delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, including the validity of the reasoning as well as the relevance and sufficiency of the evidence. And then under literature, it says the standard is not applicable to literature. Why would that not be applicable to literature?
The intention of the standard is really for them to evaluate arguments made by speakers or by, they often read speeches from politicians and deconstruct the standard. But with you, I'm not exactly sure why we didn't decide to apply it to literature, because there are examples in literature where a character would make a claim like that. In the previous standards, it had not been there either, but you were the second person I've had that question from in the past few months, but it was not one that we've received from the field on a consistent basis. But yes, to your point, I see perhaps the gap in that.
Thank you.
Nick?
Hey, good morning. I guess the question I have, as you stated, the survey results that came out about the disconnect between I understand what I teach, but yet I don't have the materials to teach. Can someone explain why the textbook cycle maybe wasn't changed also? Because, you know, maybe other subjects
Sure.
could have bumped forward and replaced with English and math.
I can start and Lauren can provide more depth. She actually manages, as of now, recently, the textbook review process as well. When the state approves certain textbooks, I believe we enter into contracts with the vendors or enter into some kind of agreement that is a 6-year period. Is that accurate?
Well, I believe it's in state statute, the cycle itself, so we would have to apply or appeal to the textbook commission to make a change to that cycle. So even though we present it to the board as well, the textbook commission is ultimately who signs off on that.
And so we're, just to be sure, language would be 2020, would that be right? And then
Correct.
math would be 2021.
That's right.
And I'll be back tomorrow to present on the textbooks for social studies because we recently went through that review process, and we'll begin our ELA review process next summer for the new aligned textbooks and instructional materials for English language arts.
Can I address that from a local board perspective? Having said on the local board, if you change that cycle, and the whole funding situation, it's a large fraction of the funding is textbooks. And if you came in and you changed that 6-year cycle, it would impact what the local boards are thinking with regard to, because they've got them set up, and certain textbooks they're going to fund and certain they're not. It would have a major impact across the state.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I would say a little historical context here. I appreciate that comment. To change the textbook cycle is like an act of Congress, truly. But ultimately, we did, 2 years ago, line everything up much more appropriately with when standards changes were happening. So when the state board is actually now approving standards, we've aligned the textbook adoption with that. But you had to do that multiple years out to be able to have the local districts actually able to fund appropriately and manage their budgets appropriately. An example of that is our science standards are being implemented this coming school year, and we actually aligned the textbook adoption with the science standards. So folks were so appreciative, but we delayed the implementation so that alignment could occur. So we're in a better place now than we were several years ago when it was very misaligned. But it's a great point, and I think we even see in our data that we'll be talking about here in just a bit, there has been a lot of feedback from educators that I appreciate the standards, I know where I'm going, but I'm still struggling with all the resources I need to adequately support it. And so that's why this adoption cycle over the next year and a half is very critical.
You made a great point about how crucial it is to make sure that educators understand this is not a whole brand new set, because as we know over the past few years, we've seen that. So is there a plan in place? What's the plan to make sure if I was an 8th grade English teacher that I am very aware that these are minor changes?
Absolutely. What I've been thinking of is after the October meeting when the standards are finalized and we know exactly what changes took place, you as board members get tracked changes versions of everything that changes on our rules, policies, and standards. The public typically doesn't see those. They see the clean copy just to avoid confusion of, was this deleted? Was that deleted? What happened? So I think that after the October meeting, when we know exactly what the changes are, we can develop a sheet, or probably 2 to 3 pages max for educators that lists out in the reading strand, here's what, if anything, changed in kindergarten, in 1st grade, and so on, and share that document widely over the next year and a half before they move into classrooms. In part just to answer a lot of the questions that were coming from the field. I think it will preemptively answer a lot of concerns, both about what the scope of these changes are and also some questions about the standards themselves, but also because, if you can fit all the changes on a front and back sheet, I think that's a good indication to folks that it's not some dramatic shift that we need to be getting really, anxious about.
Any other comments or questions?
I did want to add one comment that I forgot to address earlier. It actually doesn't have to do with the standards themselves, but the electives. So we cleaned up some formatting on the electives, but we're also adding 2 new electives that we're recommending for approval, and it is etymology. They are etymology and mythology. And those are added actually based on experience with approving special course requests from the field. We were actually getting, I think I reviewed 40 special course requests for mythology last year. So we thought if so many districts are wanting to offer it, then maybe we should recommend it as a permanent ELA elective. So those would be 2 new ones up for approval.
Excellent. Thank you both for your work. Clearly being responsive to the field is important, and I think they will appreciate the changes that have been made. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Course Access Program, Ms. Aaliyah Guthrie. Good morning.
My name is Aaliyah Guthrie, and I am here to talk to you about the Course Access Program Act, which recently passed in legislation, and we anticipate there would be a need for a rule in October. So this is just to kind of give you an overview of what is in statute, and then to start considering, kind of to begin the conversation of what might end up in the rule. So first, with a little bit of legislative history, the course access program was primarily advocated for by Excel in Ed. In 2016, Representative Kane and Senator Gresham sponsored this bill. And the idea that Chairman Kane always talks about is there's a student in one district who wants to take a Chinese course, but they don't have access to that in their high school. But the next county over, or maybe even across the state, they have a really excellent Chinese teacher or a teacher of Chinese, and they should have access to that. So let's kind of pool our resources so that all students have access to those high-quality courses. So a course access program is a school choice program. It gives students across the state the ability to take courses either in an online environment, a blended environment, or sometimes even face-to-face. So in this most recent session in 2018, the original legislation was updated so that it would be much more easy for us to implement. It was not implementable as it was written, and so we have Public Chapter 784, which brings us to today. Many states have course access programs. There are a lot of different models. So some things to consider is, what are the types of students we want to prioritize when we're designing the way this program looks. For example, in Minnesota, it's primarily a recovery program for students who need to catch up, whereas in Louisiana, it is primarily used for students who kind of want additional opportunities, AP courses, and things that are beyond graduation requirements. So back to when we're thinking about Tennessee, what some of the basic components of a course access program would be. In the statute, it allows LEAs to establish partnerships with course providers so that they can expand offerings for the students in their district. It also establishes processes for what students would be eligible and a framework for approving courses as well as providers. And then it grants authority to the state board to set expectations for quality, for monitoring, and then any other additional requirements. So the state board would approve and monitor all providers and all courses and could develop additional requirements. The department would establish timelines and guidelines for those approval processes, as well as being responsible for posting all providers and all courses on a website so that students across the state would see what's available to them. And then we would collect and generate the reports that would be used in the monitoring. LEAs have the authority to establish partnerships and to develop local policies and communication procedures for how to ensure their students know about and have access to course access courses. So some definitions that are helpful in sort of starting to picture what this would look like. A home LEA is the LEA where the student resides and attends most of their coursework. So that's where they're full-time. The host LEA would be the LEA that is providing the course through the course access program. And then a course provider is the organization or nonprofit entity that would be approved using a rubric of quality and other statutory obligations. The provider, it can be an LEA, so a host LEA and a course provider could be one and the same. But sometimes course providers are an individual charter school or a nonprofit virtual platform, or it could even be higher ed, or it even opens it up to a state agency to offer, to apply to be a course provider. But host LEAs would either be the provider or they would partner with a provider to offer courses. So in the statute, it establishes who is eligible for this program, so what types of students can participate. So any student can participate for up to two courses. So the LEA would be responsible for paying any associated fees with that course for up to 2 courses. If a student wants to take additional courses beyond those 2, then it would be up to the student and their family to pay for the cost of those additional courses. And LEAs would establish their own denial and approval process for those additional courses. An eligible student is entitled to enroll in those 2 as long as they meet all prerequisites for that course and that they don't have access to a comparable course in their own school. So it doesn't explicitly state this in statute, but it seems that would imply that this would not apply to EOC assessed subjects because they should have access to that course in their own school. And eligibility and accessibility for the first two, but then for all additional courses, you can't be denied because you have a disability. So all providers, all courses, that'll be part of the approval process, is to ensure that students with disabilities have access to these courses. So on to provider eligibility. In the statute, it says that the course provider will submit an application to the department. It lists many things that they have to have, one of which is that they comply with federal and state law, that they have evidence that they are financially viable, and then that they comply with various state board requirements, so class size requirements, licensed educators, things of that nature. So all providers would have certain quality metrics, but it is within the authority of the state board to establish other eligibility requirements for provider approval. The provider approval process will be that providers will submit an application to the department. The department will review those applications and make a recommendation for approval or not approval. The state board makes the final decision on approval of a provider or not, and that decision is final. And then approved providers will be listed on the Course Access course catalog that will be posted by the department online so that students and families and LEAs across the state know what they have the opportunity to partner with. And then there's a very similar process that happens for courses. So the course approval process looks a lot like the special course approval, where there's a rubric. Host LEAs that have partnered with an approved provider can submit courses to the department. The department would review those courses and then make a recommendation to the state board for approval or not. The state board makes the final decision, and then all approved courses go onto the Course Access catalog so students can see all of the offerings and then get in touch with their home LEA to say, I want to take this class. And so LEAs would also be, they'd have a role in this of communicating the Course Access catalog options to their students. So there are a lot of details that we still have to think through. So some of the big questions we talked, I mentioned whether or not EOC classes would be part of Course Access, and then what other elements we want to add into the course approval, the provider approval, what guidance we want to give to LEAs for establishing these partnerships, any additional student eligibility requirements. Some, like I said at the very beginning, Louisiana, they primarily use this for what we would call EPSOs. But in Minnesota, this is a credit recovery type program. So thinking about what types of students we want to target this program towards and how would that influence the way we develop the rule and policies and procedures around it. Another big question is about the flow of funds. So how much should a course cost? What's a reasonable and fair price? And whether or not the state board should establish a maximum, or if they should give parameters, or if that will be part of the course approval or provider approval process. So we are thinking about the fiscal capacity of different LEAs and having students, and the associated cost of providing these courses. So I think it'll be important to get a lot of stakeholder feedback and to continue to dialogue with you all, and we've already been in contact with TSBA and others to get their input to think about how this program would look so that it benefits all students across the state, because that's certainly its intention. So I'm happy to take any questions or take down some notes if you have ideas about where you want this to go.
Madam Chairman. Look, the first question, you said that a student, first of all, this is a great idea. I love this. This is perfect. But the two classes, who set that requirement? Who set that limit to? Is that in statute of law?
It is in statute that it would be a maximum of 2 that the LEA would be required to pay for.
Okay. Okay. Now, the only thing I kind of see with that, and of course it being law, there's really nothing that can be done here. But I am going to say it just so that just so it's out there. As high school requirements, you're required to take 3 cluster classes, CDE classes, to graduate. That fulfills your cluster requirement. At my school, we don't offer a criminal justice cluster, but the school, like you said, in a different county, it's like 5 miles from our school, they do. Well, if it takes me 3 classes to be able to graduate and I can only get 2 of them paid for, are you telling me that I have to pay to graduate high school?
So it would be, obviously the LEA would develop, a policy around those additional courses. So if students want to take additional courses beyond those first 2, I think it would be dependent on the LEA policy, like how that would work if it's part of your graduation requirements. I think that's an important question.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay.
I may have missed this, and I just scrolled through to make sure. Does the statute require districts to do this or recommend? And what is the, I see a smile, and what is the, is there, if they do have, either way, is the funding stream like whatever their actual annual budget is, or is there additional funding coming through for this?
So your first question of whether it's required that LEAs participate. So it is the only requirement for LEAs is that if they have students who want to take these courses, and they're the home LEA, then they would pay for the first 2. But if they don't, there's no requirement that they be a host LEA. So they don't have to partner with a provider to offer courses. That would be, I would imagine districts that have virtual programs already, they're sort of already set up to maybe apply to be approved as a provider. But there's not a requirement that
Okay.
anyone be a host.
So they don't have to offer it, but they have to pay for it if students want it in their district and somebody else has if students want something that somebody, so they're going to have an incentive to hopefully maybe offer the best of what they have. So the way, just to make sure I understand the way it looks. So for example, and I'm not assuming this would happen or not, but Nashville has the Nashville Academy of Computer Science, a charter school here that does coding.
Mm-hmm.
So they could theoretically become a provider and offer that to, they're their own, well, I guess they're under MNPS's LE. So Williamson County students theoretically could be like, oh, I want to take that class, and then Williamson County would have to pay for that.
Yes.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Bob?
So if I read this correctly, the LEAs will establish the denial and the appeal process. And a student is unable to enroll in a comparable course. So who determines whether they have a comparable course or not? Is it the same LEA that?
So the LEA they will establish a denial and approval for any additional courses.
Okay.
But those first 2, I think that is somewhere where in the state board rule there may be a place to elaborate on what a comparable course.
I think you're.
How do we define
I think
comparable?
and there ought to be an appeal process for that too.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
What is the timing? I was trying to see if I could see the timing for when this has to be in place.
So the hope is that in the fall of 2019 that students would be enrolling in course access courses.
So
that they would take a course access course.
There's a lot of work to do in the meantime, right?
Yes.
Any other questions? Daryl?
Great job, great program. My main comment really centers on this presentation we had from Commissioner McQueen sometime last year related to dual enrollment and the lack of access for mainly students of color. It seemed to be a challenge. And so we talked a lot about guidance counselors and the challenges they have of making students aware of the opportunity, especially if they have the aptitude and capability to pursue that. And so as we move forward with this, I guess in tandem with the challenge that exists around dual enrollment, I'd like for us to think about how we address equal access and an opportunity for all students to the best of our ability, and maybe see what influence can be applied to LEAs to ensure that students who have the capability have the opportunity to pursue that.
Yes, sir. I think that is certainly the idea behind this is that students wouldn't be limited by their geography, that their potential could be realized, that we'd be able to benefit from all of the course offerings across the state. So I agree it's very important that we establish processes that ensure equitable access.
And I would just add some transparency around who's taking it and where would be really helpful. So I think we should add in some reporting mechanism that would help with some transparency on this, and we could report out to the state board periodically on what that looks like.
And this certainly would be ramping up over time, because you can envision that in the first year, the number of host LEAs may be a relatively small number, and then the limited opportunities because of the class size restrictions. So over time, I could see this growing, and then that database of host LEAs growing, so that the capacity to offer it to more students will grow over time. But starting out, that would probably just simply not be the case. Yes.
One more quick question. On the eligibility and accessibility for students with disabilities, I know federal law would require that, but I'm just curious, is that in the statute as well, or is that?
It doesn't explicitly say. It
Okay.
says in the statute that these courses, that any provider would have to ensure that they comply with federal
All
and state
federal
law
law.
around
Okay.
these things. I just added that bullet point because I think it'll be important in our guidance to LEAs that their policies around denial and approval are being cognizant of accessibility.
Thank you for adding that bullet point.
And then I think it would be important, although maybe perhaps challenging, to how does an LEA who has the student who's interested in a course know that the money they're putting toward that is really well spent, and that is a quality program, a quality class. So I would be curious to know if a process will be in place for that as well, to assess those programs, those classes.
I think with the approving courses, but I think on the back end as well, looking at our providers maybe on an annual basis, and courses maybe on a semester by semester basis. I think that if we want to say we're offering the best to all of our students, having quality monitoring is important.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Proposed licensure actions, Ms. Brittany Kendrick.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. So I don't have any general announcement about the proposed licensure actions, but if you all do have any specific questions, I can be happy to answer them. If you have
I'm
any.
not looking at you.
Look at me.
Wendy.
So I'm going to ask absent an answer here that I'm not sure I'm going to get, but Jeremiah Justice, is there something I'm missing from the materials? The suspension, a 1-year suspension with a boundaries training feels not right to me. When I read through this and I see that this high school student actually goes to her middle school teacher to say this teacher is watching me in my shorts and reaching out to me and sending me texts, that to me feels much more like what we usually revoke for. So I'm just curious and it's my home county, so I also think about it with my children.
Right. And so the thought process in the case review, and again, we're looking at a bunch of different ones. And
Right.
so when we particularly were in the case review and looking at the other ones we've seen, we didn't get the impression that he was trying to groom her for a relationship, because there was instances where she actually reached out to him to confide in him and talk to him about just what was going on in her life. And so taking all of that into consideration, that is why we made the recommendation that we did. But again, it's just a recommendation. So
I'm going to request to pull that one and have it heard separately, because I cannot, in good conscience, let him be in any district with their students. So just like every district. And then I had if it looks like B and C and maybe D Those were all ones that we had asked you to look at and come back with, right? Am I right on
So
this?
B and C were, yes.
Okay, but
D
not-
is a new one.
Okay, but D has the
Common practice.
alcohol treatment.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, so I think those, thank you for doing those. One other one that I just had a question about, I don't think I have any others to pull. Oh, on M, our denial for the license, looks like it was based on Ohio permanently revoking him.
Yes.
Am I correct
so
on that? And
that
it
is
looked like
correct.
some sort of, it was checked sexual in nature, but I didn't see any.
Right, so because of the nature of the case in Ohio, I couldn't get the details, specific details about what actually happened in Ohio.
Does USA Today know that?
And so typically how I can get that information is if he was to request a hearing, obviously I could
Okay.
subpoena them. But when I spoke to a representative from Ohio, basically the person did inform me that he decided to surrender his license in lieu of continuing with their investigation into him. And that they revoked his license based upon their investigative statute. And so she wouldn't give me all the details, but it did involve likely would involve children's names, and they don't like to usually release if they're involving students and minors' names. But it was based upon the action in Ohio that he had surrendered his license, and it's a permanent surrender.
And then I think the only other one I have a question about is on, it looks like on all of these alcohol-related ones, which are like a relief from the, sexual ones, actually, that we're requiring proof of treatment, but it looks like are they all retroactive?
Some of them are retroactive because they're older in nature, so that it will be on their record, but the hold and the suspension essentially will not be released until they give me proof that their treatment has been
Contingency,
completed.
okay. On P, is that one doesn't say it's retroactive, and it's pretty recent, so would that one be from the point of?
The order, so it would be from the
Okay.
vote going forward. So tomorrow, if you all vote to suspend his license, it would be effective from tomorrow, 2 years forward.
2 years, okay. Because my only, in my criminal defense days, that he blew a .141 at, he left at 10:30 in the morning to take, so supposedly 12 hours after he finished drinking, like that's
right,
not normal. I mean, he either didn't finish drinking at 1:30 and was drinking on his way to school, which is my guess. So definitely, I'm glad that we're doing these contingencies and requiring treatment, because I think
Right.
it's allowing these folks an opportunity to better themselves and potentially get back in the classroom.
I agree. Any other comments? Yes, Darrell.
Item K,
Yes.
I was wondering, I was looking at our matrix of category of infraction, basically, and potential penalty.
Yes.
And, this one struck me as falling under the category of no harm, but with potential harm. But the penalty seems to be in line with no harm and no potential harm. But if you let 2 students from a behavioral program leave on 3 separate occasions, that just seems to be negligence
Right.
with potential for harm to me.
I understand. So our theory, the reason behind that was why we fell under negligence without harm or potential harm is given the investigative file from the district. Sometimes when we do a lot of these and I present these to case review staff, is we have to think about too, like if they request a hearing, what is that going to look like to an administrative judge in a hearing process? And the district didn't have a lot of information to give me about the specifics of what was transpiring, because how they became aware of the situation is based upon one of the parents saying that to them, but they didn't have any, and I don't want to throw the district under the bus, but they didn't have any actual like investigative or materials to present to me to further go beyond the higher, I guess, matrix on our matrix. And so that's why we fell under negligence without harm or potential harm, just given the investigative style and what the district had to offer. But again, these are all just recommendations. So, I mean, if you all want to, if it's a consensus that it should be on a higher matrix, that can be pulled and voted on separately for a different recommendation. I would just have to give the educator notice.
Well, if we know he let them leave 3 separate times, and lied about it. You know, that just seems to be rather egregious to me. With the potential for those students to, anything could have happened to them.
Right.
I did ask the same question because I had the same concern. And in speaking with Elizabeth and Brittany, one thing I know that we want to make sure too, we want to be consistent. That's why we have that matrix. We want to follow that matrix. And so I had the same question and concern. And then again, going back to them and making sure that in prior decisions, and they're all different. That's the challenge, the nature of the licensure, their behavior. They're all different. So I think we need to make sure, because I think several of us are having the same questions and concerns.
And honestly, and since my time here and going back and look at other cases of the board, I haven't seen anything similar to this to like say, okay, you all 2 years ago in this situation, we had similar circumstances, we did this. So there's really not that basis just yet. Next board meeting, you will see something similar to this, but obviously we can't based upon that. So, I mean, again, if you all want to discuss it tomorrow further and have a separate recommendation, that's fine.
And we did struggle with this one as a case review committee. I remember talking about it, and I think just then evidence was the only thing sort of pushing us in this direction, but I could easily make a case for a different
Right.
proposal too.
If you give it to me, I can make a case for either side in all of these.
I would, Daryl, if you want to pull it just and discuss it separately, I'm all for that as well. I had this one kind of marked and then I got caught up in the other one.
Before we do that, are we suggesting that we pull it? Yes, okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So here I was wondering, from prior history, whether revocation is permanent?
So prior to this rule that we have now, permanent revocation is an option going from actions that took place March 5th going forward, excuse me, of this year. Prior to that, no, there was no option for permanent revocation. With Mr. Alexander and the entirety of the Praxis exam cheating scandal, as a staff and as a review committee, and just given the nature of like other decisions that the board has made, given, just various different things that center around this, we've just taken a stance to recommend denial of reinstatements for these. And some have, I would say he's the first one that hasn't requested a hearing. Several of them have gone through the hearing route or before the ALJ. We've only had, since they've come back up, this is their like fifth year to basically their diversion is up now. So we have had at least one go before an ALJ, and the ALJ has sided with us as far as agreeing with the denial. I will have several pending hearings in September and October and August, making obviously the same argument, and we'll see what the ALJs do going forward, but this is the first one that you all are seeing because they've usually requested a hearing, therefore you all don't get a chance to vote either way on it. But that's the position. Just given the board's trajectory and decisions made on other things, we recommended denial. But again, you all can decide for sure. This is the first opportunity, I guess, you all are deciding whether or not you want to take the stance that they shouldn't get their license back given the situation, or give them an opportunity to show other course. And so this is the first one you all are seeing where you all get to decide. Yeah, so his license was revoked in 2013. I think the scandal hit head in 2012 when all of them were either called or entered into agreements with, most of them entered into agreements with the U.S. Attorney's Office out of the Western District of Tennessee in beginning of 2013. So yeah, their 5 years has been, and part of their agreement, I don't know if they discussed with any of us, the state board when they agreed, but I know a lot of the part of the agreements were that they would not teach during that 5 years. So a lot of them, probably all of them that have come up are now asking for reinstatement at this point.
And Brittany, just to clarify, he was told, this is what I'm going to recommend to the board unless I hear that you want a hearing, and he did
Right,
not
and so
request a hearing.
He did not request a hearing. He reached out to me and asked me like what, the process would be if he did request a hearing, et cetera. And I explained that to him, and then I never heard back from him.
Okay, so he clearly got the certified
Yes,
mail and
everyone
asked
in
questions
this,
about it.
in this packet or this group has received the notice of recommendation. I have a green card or email confirmation exchange with them, and they have not requested a hearing. So again, yeah, it's someone there that I guess this is you all's first opportunity to decide how you all, what stance you all want to take on these practices. Because I mean, they're still, like I said, most of them have requested a hearing, but there may be a couple that come down the line that may not request a hearing that you all will, again, get to decide how you all. Okay. And that was A, Corey Alexander.
Okay.
No, so that is a separate appeal, right? Yes, so this is, I guess, as we discussed, I discussed with you on one-on-one. So yes, there are individuals who we have, because what will happen is an educator will obviously apply for a license, and they have to answer those personal information questions that talk about felony convictions, drug charges. Do they have a prior licensure action from another state or the state of Tennessee, or any pending licensure actions? And the felony conviction questions is all and drug charges is all encompassing, and the acts about misdemeanors, et cetera. So we do have, I can't speak to specifically if we have felony convicted individuals teaching. I do know that we have made some, like here recently, some recommendations to, for example, in the future, if this person doesn't request a hearing, she was felony convicted of, I can't remember if it was, it wasn't the identity theft. It may have been arson, and she was sentenced to 4 years supervised probation and some other things she had to do before her probation was lifted. And so the recommendation we made is that she be suspended concurrent with her probation. So we have taken the stance of, like, depending upon what the conviction is, what the actual charge is, we may go with what the court did, or so I mean, it varies. So, and again, those are ones that may come before you all in the coming months for vote as to whether or not you all agree that it should be a supervised or a concurrent suspension with the probation, et cetera, or should it be revocation or denials in this case, et cetera. But the rules do specifically say that we can, or that you all as a board can choose to refuse to issue, deny, or suspend or revoke for felony convictions. I mean, it's plain as day.
Any other comments, questions for Brittany? Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you all.
Our last official agenda item, TN Ready results and updates. Commissioner McQueen. I do want to state that we felt that with the recent release of the TN Ready data, we would take this opportunity to receive an update and realize that in October at our meeting, we will go into more in-depth with school-specific data.
I'll go ahead and start as they're getting set up. So I'm going to give some introductory comments and then turn it over to Mary Badawala, who is our Assistant Commissioner for our assessment, accountability, and data governance work. And then after she talks about some of our overarching changes and responses to what happened in the spring, I will give more detail about our results on TN Ready from 2018 and the context for those results. So we'll start, Mary, if you'll go ahead and flip to that first slide. We do have an overview of the 2018 testing window. We'll do that briefly, talk about all of the improvements that have happened over the summer, and then some specificity, and we'll open it up to questions before I talk about results. So Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yes, I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to this group about our testing administration last spring and some of the things we're doing to set us up for success in 18-19. So in 2018, in the spring, we tested about 650,000 students on our TN Ready test, and about half of those, a little less than half, 300,000, actually took the test online, which was the largest number we've actually ever had take our state assessment online. So as you all probably know, all of our high school students took the end of course assessments online, and we had about a third of our middle grade students in grades 6 through 8 also take the assessments online. We also allowed fifth grader the option to take this test online, and we saw about 15% opt into that option. So all told, we had about 300,000 students who experienced TN Ready on the online platform this spring. So I say all that to give you a little bit of context. We have many subparts to each of our assessments, and so in total we had about 2 million subtests submitted in the spring. But as you all know, that is not to say they were submitted without difficulty. We know that the experience that our students and teachers and district administrators faced while taking the online assessment was not without challenge, and we are highly committed to making sure that we turn this around such that our students can experience our test in a seamless fashion. So I want to touch upon a few of the issues that we experienced, because unfortunately it wasn't just one thing that we faced. There were a number of issues that caused the online challenges that our students and teachers experienced. All of the challenges, although somewhat different in nature, manifested in a very similar way. Basically, students had issues when going to log into the assessment or when attempting to submit the assessment. There were slowdowns, spinning wheels, etc. So things that were frustrating for folks. So you see here the 5 unique challenges that caused these problems. The first, actually on day 1, unfortunately, in the morning, we saw an interaction that was a negative interaction between our test platform and another product that the vendor provides. It's actually a product used for teachers to create formative benchmark assessments. So it's a good product. Unfortunately, the product itself interacted with the platform in an unanticipated way that caused slowdowns for students on the first day of testing. On the second day of testing, we saw the most significant event, and at the time it presented as a denial of service attack. Subsequently, with the help of an independent investigation, we've determined that this was actually a result of another issue we faced, which was the unapproved change that the vendor made in our text-to-speech feature. The third issue actually occurred because someone at the vendor made an unapproved and unexpected maintenance update in the middle of the testing day, and again, it caused our students slow down. The fourth item is something that can always be potentially something that could happen, which was that we simply had something happened to the internet in the state for some of our districts. And so there was a fiber optic cable outage that was not related to the vendor, but it did have an impact on some of our districts. And then finally, you see that fifth issue, which I've already mentioned. And this has turned out to be the most significant underlying issue in terms of our challenges. And again, that was that the vendor made an unapproved change to their platform between the fall and spring testing windows and how they delivered that text-to-speech accessibility feature for our students. And that unfortunately caused slowdowns and challenges with the platform. As a result of the challenges, as you likely know, our General Assembly decided to pass some laws that related to how we use the data that came from the spring testing window. So notably, they required that no adverse action occur to teachers, students, or LEAs based whole or in part on any student achievement data generated from the spring testing window and actually from 2017-18 TN Ready generally. And you all, of course, passed a complementary policy in the spring as well. Additionally, as part of this, they prohibited the use of 17-18 data from being used in assigning an A through F letter grade to schools. So we will not be using the data for that purpose or assigning A through F letter grades at all. As a result of this legislation and policy, we did release a number of resources to our schools and districts such that they could make sense of what this meant for them. So that's a recap of what was. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we are doing at the department to make sure that 1819 goes very smoothly. And as part of this work, the first thing, of course, we wanted to do was make sure we fully understood the experiences of our stakeholders. And so we engaged in a number of feedback sessions and feedback loops with those folks who really experienced the painful challenges this spring. So here you can see the different methods we use to get feedback from the field. First, we did do a survey of our directors, and it was a very telling survey and really opened up a lot of areas of improvement that I hope you'll see we're addressing through a number of these changes. We actually had in-person conversations with directors of schools. We went across the state to each of our 3 large regions and sat down with our directors and really heard what they had to say in terms of how we can make this a better experience for folks. We've been engaging with our assessment task force members as we have been throughout the course of the last few years, but in May and July, we really focused on ways we could improve this program. In terms of technical advisory, we actually have a technical advisory committee that's made up of folks who have the expertise in technical aspects of assessment, and we've really been engaging with them to make sure that all of the things we're doing with our assessment are according to industry best practices. Of course, we've had hearings and conversations with members of the General Assembly, and we've gathered additional feedback from teachers, students, administrators, school boards, parents, etc. We've really tried to reach out to the full gamut of folks who are involved and affected by our testing program. So we've done this subsequently since the testing window. We also received a lot of real-time feedback throughout the testing window by engaging with our field in daily webinars, and we actually had an open phone line running during business hours every day of the testing window that folks could call into. And so these were really useful ways that we solicit real-time feedback during the testing window. We also use text messages. That's a new thing we did this year, and we found it was really helpful during some of these challenges to quickly communicate with the folks on the ground. So as a result of those feedback loops, we've done a number of things to improve the program moving into 1819. So the first things I want to talk about are the things we're doing that concretely relate to our assessment vendor and the delivery of our assessment. So first, in order to make sure that our vendor was held accountable, we did reduce invoices from our delivery vendor, which is Questar, by $2.5 million. We also made the decision that we wanted to set ourselves up going forward to have the best delivery vendor for our test. And as a result of that, we're actually working right now on creating a new RFP to solicit proposals for new delivery vendor who can best meet our needs, beginning in 2019-20. So we will be with Questar this current school year, given the timeline, but we are working to solicit new delivery vendor for 1920 to ensure we have the best partner to do this work. Since we will be with Questar for this school year, we are working to amend the contract to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for the best assessment experience in 1819. As part of that amendment, we actually also worked to move all of our test development work into a contract with ETS. So as some of you may know, ETS has been a vendor we've worked with over the past few years to develop our science and social studies assessments. Questar was actually doing our math and ELA assessment development work. However, given the delivery challenges we saw, we felt like the way to set them best up for success in 1819 was to allow ETS, who's done a really great job with development, to take on all the development work such that Questar could really focus on the delivery of the assessment instead of having to focus on the entire end-to-end assessment product. We're also adjusting the pace of our transition to online. So our plan was for 1819 to continue with all EOCs online, as well as move all grade 5 through 8 students online. However, we've always talked about the need for proof points before we continue with that transition. And we really just don't feel like at this juncture, and I think you all would agree, that we have the proof points we need to make the decision to continue with our transition. As a result of that, we are continuing with end-of-course assessments online for this coming year, but we will not be transitioning 5 through 8 online. All grades 3 through 8 students will be taking all operational assessments on paper this coming school year. We do have an opportunity with our science assessment. As you know, we're changing our science standards next year, and so we will not have an operational science test. And so we felt this was a good opportunity to go ahead and give our 5th through 8th graders a low stakes exposure to online testing. So our 5th through 8th graders will be taking the field test, the non-operational science test online, but all operational assessments for grades 3 through 8 will be on paper this coming year. At our request, Questar is actually working with a third-party vendor, Microsoft, to really evaluate all of their technological capabilities and systems. And as a result of that external evaluation, they're going to work to make any changes that Microsoft recommends or finds. And then finally, we're working on a number of other things to really streamline administration. So some of this is kind of weedy. For example, we're moving to 1 core form rather than 2 core forms, which may not mean a lot to you, but is something that's actually been really positively received from the field who deal with the day in and day out logistics of assessment. We also heard a need for better customer service. We know that this was not an area where folks felt like they were served this past spring, and we know it was an area where we actually needed a really, really good response given the challenges we faced. So as a result of that, we've launched a new TN Ready Ambassador program. We actually received over 900 applications for this program. It's a tremendous response, and we've already made the selection for these folks. But basically, it's a group of 31 teachers who are really going to work closely with us to make sure we have a high-quality assessment, and a group of 6 testing coordinators throughout the state who are going to work with us to make sure we're considering all the experiences that they have in the field so that we're really meeting the needs of the folks who are doing the work. We're also hiring a full-time role at the department to solely focus on customer service. This is someone that we can use to deploy out into the state to really help folks get the training they need to feel comfortable when we're in the middle of an assessment window. Of course, we're hopeful that all the things we're doing will not, lead us to a place where we were this past spring, but we know that with assessment, especially an online assessment, there's always the possibility for a challenge, and we want to make sure that folks are prepared for those challenges. And then finally, there's a number of things we're doing to reduce testing time. That's something that we're always hearing about, and it's something that we really want to work to be respectful of instructional time while still maintaining a high-quality assessment program. So we found a number of ways in which we can do this in 1819. First of all, we're not going to be doing any standalone field testing. So for the past 2 years, as we've transitioned to a new assessment, we've had to conduct a standalone field test during the month of March. And that's a lot to ask about a third of our students to participate in a testing window all throughout March and then turn around and do it again in April. And we recognize that is something that has been hard for folks. And so we've committed to doing no more standalone field testing for the next 2 years. We feel like our item bank is at a place where we have enough material to create high quality assessments, and that's something that we see as an opportunity that we no longer need to do for at least 2 years. We've also, per the recommendations of our assessment task force, made eliminations to tests that are commonly taken during the 11th grade year. So we have eliminated chemistry and the English 3 assessment. As you know, we also do ACT testing during the 11th grade, and so at the recommendation of the assessment task force, we felt like that was a place where students were doing a lot of testing, and these 2 assessments were assessments that we could eliminate for the betterment of the program. We've reduced test time and length in grades 3 and 4 in our ELA assessments. So we've gone from about 220 minutes on those grades ELA assessments down to 180, so pretty significant reductions. We're also reducing the time of the science test by 20 minutes in grades 5 through 8. So this reduction will be part of the field test this year and then operational in 1819. And finally, as you know, we're making changes to our standards in grades 3 through 5 social studies in the next few years. And so as a result of that, we decided to put a pause, not an elimination, but a pause on grades 3 through 5 social studies tests next year while our field makes preparations to transition to those new standards, which are pretty large, particularly in grade 5 with the change to the standards to accommodate Tennessee history. So that's a lot, and I just want to end by saying that TN Ready is really an excellent test. It's built upon the standards that are really, really strong, and we've had a number of feedback mechanisms from national studies that have really reiterated to us and affirmed the work that we're doing with standards is the right work to do for Tennessee. What we need to do, however, is, of course, make sure this assessment, which is an excellent assessment aligned to our excellent standards, can be administered seamlessly. And so we want to set our current vendor up for success for this year and really look for a partner moving forward who can deliver this assessment without all of the challenges we saw last spring. As you know, TN Ready is a different type of assessment than we've had in the past. We have different types of questions that go to a depth that we've never gone before with our old TCAP assessments. And so because of this, it really provides some valuable feedback that teachers, schools, and districts can use to make instructional improvements for their students. And again, that's why it's a very, very important for us, to you all, to everyone, that we find a way to deliver this assessment and provide results without all of the challenges that we have had, especially in this current school year. So I'm going to stop there. I believe the commissioner is going to actually talk us through what we've seen in the data from this year.
Before you do
Yes,
that, I do have a question. Would you clarify when you say a new RFP? I know what that means. But to a lot of people out in the field, I don't think it's really clear what you all mean. The test is not changing, but the RFP, you're just issuing a new one to attract new vendors. You're not rewriting the parameters within that RFP. So whatever was previously in the RFP that Questar earned, are you changing any of those requirements within the RFP significantly, minorly, or at all?
So I think your question is a great one. So we're actually not even releasing an RFP for the assessment design. We actually have a contract that will continue with ETS to design and develop all of our state assessments. So the content, the questions, the alignment to standards, all of those things, there will be no changes. And not only will there be no changes, we're actually sticking with a vendor who's really shown us that they are capable of doing great work. We're still going to the same place. So we're getting on a plane, we're still going to the same place. We just need to make sure that plane can get us there without any problems. And so the RFP is actually soliciting a vendor who can deliver the content and the high quality assessments that already exist. There will be no changes to the actual content or design. The RFP is just simply to find and secure someone who can deliver it without challenges. And of course, that vendor will also score. And then we're soliciting also someone to provide the reports. But the reports themselves, we've heard good feedback. We've done a lot of, feedback tours to get feedback on the reports. The design themselves will not change. It's just the person who's doing it.
That's what I thought, but I also wanted to be clear that the actual RFP, because you have to put parameters within it, you're not making wholesale changes per se to it to find the right vendor, or did you have to do that? That's what I'm looking for clarity on.
Yeah, so we will actually be writing an RFP to solicit the delivery vendor.
Completely new.
Completely new, not for the design and the development, for the delivery, scoring, and reporting.
Okay.
There are some things we've noticed that we can improve upon since the last RFP, especially on the online components. When we issued the last RFP, we were still very much in a paper world, and we know now there's a lot of lessons learned, and we want to apply those to the solicitation of our next vendor.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I appreciate the question about it, lessons learned, and we also have some external partners who are going to work with us, like from the Center on Assessment, on the actual components of the online that need to be developed in the RFP that were never in the original RFP. And so that will be cleaner and clearer on the scale, expertise, and what you should have already been able to do in other states at the scale where we are. And that will be a significant portion of the scoring of the RFP going forward. And for timeline, that goes out in October, and our goal would be to have a specific vendor in place with a contract in the spring.
Thank you. Wendy?
So that, oh, I am on. That was my question. It said 1920. So 1819, we're staying with Questar?
Right, the design and development work has already shifted to ETS, so
Right.
all of that. But the actual vendor who is delivering will continue to be Questar. We're in a contract with them through November, and we extended that with some specificity, real specificity on changes that needed to be made and some quality controls that needed to be in place. And that's all in negotiation now, but going well in terms of the amendment piece.
And was it Questar the first, like 2 years ago when we had problems? Was that Questar too?
No, that was Measurement Incorporated, and we did cancel that contract.
Okay. And I'm assuming in this new contract, it says don't do maintenance on test day?
It actually already said that in the contract, yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Daryl?
ETS acquired Questar, right?
That's correct. About a year ago, after we were under contract with Questar, ETS did acquire them, which I know to many people sounds like, oh, they're one and the same. But from a business perspective, they are still very distinct companies. For some of the activities that Questar subcontracts with ETS, that requires an entire business relationship through contracts. So again, it is very meaningful that ETS is doing all of our development work because they are someone with a very high level of quality and proven track record of success.
Yeah, because the acquisition was recent. It wasn't.
It's about a year ago. It was
a year
after
ago.
we executed our current contract with Questar.
And I think they're still functioning separately.
Very much
different
so.
Leadership,
different presidents. Yes,
we
ma'am.
work with different program managers. If they subcontract, you go through a different contracting process. We compare it to like if Amazon bought Whole Foods, you still have these separate entities, but one bought the other, and so there's a relationship certainly there, but we are working with individual entities and program managers at both.
That's correct.
Yes, Bob?
I can appreciate why you did not use teachers and the student scores, et cetera. But yesterday I met with 2 deans of education for EPPs, and my understanding is you still are using that with regard to their scores. Is that correct? And if so, why?
I'm happy to jump in there too. So this will be an ongoing conversation. I mentioned this to our advisory council that until, really in conversation with the department, until we have sort of the final data from this year of administration, it's hard to determine, what makes sense in terms of both the report card and the annual reports. It's the annual reports that really drive their accountability. So I think it's still an open question, but it seems like signs are leading towards, a lot of confidence in the data that we did collect. So Commissioner, I don't know if you want to add anything, but again, that's sort
Sure.
of fluid conversation until we get the final results.
Educator prep programs weren't thought about in the actual legislation, and so we certainly moved forward with what was clear in the legislation and what that meant in terms of adverse action, but we're going to be smart and thoughtful on what this looks like for EPP. Certainly, as a former dean, we'll make sure that happens, but it was just not thought about in the legislation, so we're ultimately having to walk through then what does that mean for how that reports, and we'd be happy to talk through that in our subcommittee of the board before we actually make a final decision.
Thank you. Commissioner?
So I will move through some of our results from 2018, but I would be remiss if I didn't say publicly to this board and certainly to the individuals who are our stakeholders who may be watching this workshop, we anticipated something different in spring administration. We certainly are mindful of the challenges that occurred, and we have done everything really in our control to make the right changes moving forward, but also to frame these results in the way that we believe they should be framed. And so I'm going to talk about the results, and then I want to talk to you about the context of these results as we continue to use them. But also remember, that it was during a rocky time period. Mary uses a great analogy. We got to the end of the marathon, but it was a hard marathon to finish. And while you had all of these submissions, it was challenging. And so we want to be honest about that as we're sharing this. But we also had a technical review of the results and really tried to look at what were potential in the results that would make them invalid. And they really have come back to us and said, with a very, very lengthy report, that they saw very little that could be explained by the online challenges, except very minimal subscore differences where a student had to log on multiple times. And so as you read this, I want to share that, and then I'll talk to you about what minimal means, because minimal truly is minimal in the large scale of things. But we know motivation may have been a factor too, and so I'll talk about that at the end. So generally, our TN Ready scores for 2018 showed mixed results. There were some encouraging areas of progress, and I do want to note that the varied results were truly varied. There were some districts, as we've shown in our top 10 list, in some improvement areas, and certainly in some of their overall achievement that showed a great strength, and we want to honor that. That happened in many of our districts across the state. But we also had districts who had very mixed results. They showed improvements in some areas, and then in other areas they went backwards. There were some trends statewide. We had strong growth in English language arts for elementary grades. Certainly some districts showed really strong growth there. And we had some improvement, although very slight, in high school math. Students in our historically disadvantaged student groups also showed progress. The gaps between student groups narrowed in multiple areas, and I'll point out a couple of those. And then generally our students in priority schools, including the Achievement School District, grew faster than their non-priority school peers across the board. We saw areas, though, of need, and the one I would point out, and I want to actually connect it to something that you're looking at in first reading tomorrow, we saw a real focus needed in middle school, particularly middle school math, middle school English language arts. There were areas where we feel like we have got to strengthen our support of what's happening in middle school, everything from the content that our teachers have as they're teaching middle school math, teaching middle school English language arts, also to the support that we give them on the resource side that was just brought out earlier in our conversation. So tomorrow you're going to see in first reading some changes to some of the assessments. And I know that was brought up in the first presentation today. We think those assessments for our educator prep programs who are helping our students get licensed for middle grades math and thinking about the subtest that will now have individual scores that are content specific will help us continue to make sure our middle school teachers have the sufficient content knowledge for what they're being asked to teach. We did see declines in science, which reinforces the need for supporting our teachers as we're going through a very important year this next year with implementation of our new science standards. We did hear anecdotally that many teachers had already started making the transition. The science standards have been out, they're excited about them, and the transition was already occurring, so they knew that this was the last year of the old test, which was still in TCAP form, and so potentially that transition had already started. At the district level, all but 3 districts increased proficiency areas in at least one major content area or grade band, but we only had 20% of districts that improved in the majority of subjects and grades. And so that highlights, again, the varied nature of what we saw. We do see reason to be encouraged. Again, some of that early grades work that we've been so focused on, we saw momentum there. But we also see that we've got to start some focus, particularly, again, in middle school, and I'm going to give some context to some of our high school results. So let's look at this slide, slide 15, that shows some of these results. And I'm going to start with high school. We made some shifts in high school ELA on how the writing was graded. Multiple years ago, I want to say it was even before my time, there was a policy decision that was made that as TN Ready was transitioned into its first few years, that there would be 2 sections of the writing rubric that would be double counted. So grammar wouldn't have the same weight as organization and development of your thoughts in writing. So this was the first year that that actually kicked in. And so there is a potential that that then created a bit of a new baseline for ELA in terms of results. But I would also say we have fewer students who are actually taking our ELA test and in particular our U.S. history test. And that may be because we have a large number of students that are now taking EPSOs. They're taking dual enrollment, AP, dual credit. And as a reminder, those students do not also take TN Ready. And so if you have 5,000, I'll use U.S. history as an example. We had 5,000 fewer students take the U.S. history TN Ready exam this year than we did the year before. And we're doing an analysis, but we believe a vast majority of those had moved to an EPSO, which we're supporting as a state, which means they're now not in this, this number that we're seeing. So when we see some drop, we're also trying to look at the full context that these are kids who are in college-level coursework. Also, as a reminder, that's still counted in district accountability positively and in school accountability positively, but it does pull them out of necessarily the TN Ready EOC. Math, while we had a very slight increase, we see continuing challenges across the board in math. Again, high school marginal improvement. There were some districts that had some dramatic improvement in math. I called a couple of them and I said, I want to hear what you're doing differently in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. 201, and I talked to 4. They all said, I changed teachers. I changed out teachers. And I have teachers now that are really strong in those areas, and I had to make some hard calls. So again, a testament to the value of the effective teachers in these math courses. If you look at middle school, I already mentioned, we saw slight declines across the board, and we believe there are some reasons why we need to focus there. You know, in our prioritization in both your strategic plan and the department's strategic plan, we've talked a lot about early literacy and then the high school and bridge to post-secondary, but we haven't prioritized the middle grades as much in our vision or our context or how we talk about this work. So we're trying to regroup on how do we make sure that middle school is not lost in the conversation. And then again, in elementary, fairly flat, but we did have improvement in English language arts. I just should note at the bottom, our social studies grades 3-8 test was a field test. Tomorrow you will be voting on the cut scores that we're bringing to you as a result of the standard setting that was just complete with our teachers in the field. I do want to note a positive around our students in historically underserved populations. While they are not still where we want them to be, we saw them grow faster than their peers on this past year's test, and this frequently was bucking the trend while the overall progress was down. This particular chart shows part of that story. I love this chart because it talks about our EL students, our English learners who have actually exited EL services. They outgrew all students. So if they had been in EL services and then they exited, they were growing faster than all students. And that, again, is a testament to our teachers who have done such a good job across our state with EL. Is it where it needs to be? Absolutely not, but at least the trending is now going in the right direction. Student groups also outpaced their peers across the board in English, so wanted to point that out. Again, not where we need to be, but you'll see even on this chart, our English learners were ultimately outpacing peers in English, and this is attributed again to those students who had been exited from EL services over the past year. As I mentioned at the beginning, context around our disruptions this spring. Again, vast majority of our tests were still on paper, but we did have slightly under half that were online. And so with our administration challenges, we had a third-party expert, Humro, that actually did an analysis of the results to see if these interruptions impacted the scores. And in their analysis, they found minimal impact on the overall scores, but specifically where they saw impact on a scale score point value of 250 to 450 points, there may have been a 5 subscore, scale score point difference for a student who had to log on multiple times. So again, minimal meaning a handful of points out of a 250 to 450 point test. So that was the only place that they saw when they used the term minimal, there may have been some impact. The rest of the research questions that they analyzed, they saw no impact. And regardless, we know that because of policy adjustments and the law that was passed, that we are ensuring that there's no adverse action that's taken against students or schools or teachers or districts as we use this data for accountability. I do want to note that many directors shared that beyond what might have been seen in the online disruptions, because of the number of conversations that were happening and the media coverage at the time that they were taking the test, it set a tone that could have impacted student performance. Adult behavior really does impact student performance. The conversations that were being had at the time on does this count, does this not count, impact student performance. And our director said that that motivation could have also played a part in what the results are. And so while we can't quantify that, we can't get in a student's mind and quantify what that looks like, we want to give a nod to what we certainly heard from the field and note that as we talk about the context. We do believe these are results that we absolutely should be using and learning from. A director told me yesterday, he said, if we choose to not use these, we're going to lose a year. He said this information is extraordinarily valuable. Those standards analysis reports we're using in our professional development right now. And he said, I would tell every director that this is important data that you have to use to think about the big picture as you continue to plan for the year. We are using these results to inform some of our next steps. We feel like the work that we're doing in early grades reading is going in the right direction. We've got to pick up the pace. There's urgency in these early grades. And so we believe the start with Read to Be Ready is important, and we're excited that later today in our THEC meeting, you'll hear about our Ready with Resources work, which several of you have now pointed out, which is that next stage of making sure materials and resources that match the level of the standards is available to every single teacher as we walk through our reading work. We also believe our middle and high school teachers just quite frankly need more support on the actual content themselves. We have an advisory group that just started for our English language arts or our literacy teams that are working through what is our middle school and high school work going to be that sort of extends Read to Be Ready into the grade levels that we haven't touched yet. Those advisory teams have already met. We have individuals from higher education. We have some of our best and brightest middle school and high school teachers and administrators who are part of that advisory team. Mathematics is, again, always an area of emphasis that we've had, and we are thrilled that we are now doing what are called their learning walks, for lack of a better way to say it, very, very explicit classroom observations that our core offices are doing to share what can you do differently in math, what are you doing that's very strong, and then how do you apply that to your lesson planning and preparation. And then finally, we have to continue our focus on priority schools. We have gotten some momentum there, and our work continues to be a priority for us by the very nature of what we call them, priority schools. And to go backward or think differently right now about priority schools would be a mistake. We have to keep the urgency there. We have to keep the focus on making sure all kids have high quality options and choices. And we believe this focus on priority schools is the right focus for our state. So I will stop there and open it up to questions.
Wendy?
Thank you. Thank you both for the information. And, you know, we all know we have to get it right, like that there is a lot of noise against testing, and the more that this happens, the harder it gets to justify. And as a parent who firmly believes in the importance of testing and accountability, I want us to get it right. So I don't want to like water under the bridge. We just got to figure out how to move forward. But one of the questions I have, I mean, it is clear we have a lot of work to do, and I'm all for applauding, you know, the improvements. But I mean, when 1 in 5 kids in high school is at grade level, that's a problem, right? And so one of the things that I think will help when I talk to educators, parents, other community members who care about education in my district, they all believe in this, but they need to see like the value of it. And so this feedback loop. So we still don't have school level or student level data, do we?
Mary,
Do we
why
have
don't you
that yet?
describe what's already been put out in the field, because the vast majority has been now put out.
Absolutely. So we delivered all of the end of course district and school level data to districts in a secure fashion on June 13th. we followed up with the delivery of all of our 3-8 data as well as other test results like English language proficiency on July 5th. All of the paper reports for like student and parent reports for end of course have been in district offices since July 13th. And our communicated date for 3-8 paper reports was July 31st. And those paper reports were actually on the printer last night, and they will be arriving on July 31st. So we have learned, and I think you have a good point here, that districts have various ways of distributing the paper reports that we provide. So although all districts have had the paper reports since July 13th for end of course assessments, it is clear to us that not all districts have turned those around to parents or students. And that's something we want to make sure we work on getting a better process around.
Yes, so the only thing that hasn't been delivered yet, the paper version of 3-8 that goes to the families are into this month, and then our value-added data, the school level value-added is August 3rd, and basically the teacher level value-added is the middle of August, like the week of August 13th. So all the timelines have been moved up in a very positive way. We're getting good response from that. I love your question about are the parents and students getting the information in a timely way? And we believe the answer potentially is no, because we're waiting for school to start to then deliver those. And so in our assessment task force this past meeting, we started talking about how should we think differently about the reporting. Could there be a log on like you do with AP test where parents and kids have a log on, and then in the summer when it's available you get an email saying it's available and you can go on and see it as opposed to waiting for the district to get it to you. So that is something we're thinking through in our new RFP. That would be a new way to report the data much more timely, and then you don't have the cost of postage to get it to you or the personnel you physically have to mail it all out.
I think that's fantastic, and that's the direction I would love to see the department go, and it will shock you not at all that I would love to see it even earlier. And I'll give it, like if my child's in his 8th grade class and they take the tests and then they get it, even if they get it in July, but right now they get it in August or September, they're at a new school. Like that teacher has no use for that as a feedback loop for that student or for the kids in their class. Now, they may be able to then benefit and improve on their teaching skills, and that's great for the next class. But as far as a parent, that student, and as a teacher helping improve my class, I have no way of doing it. This kid's in another school or in another grade. So especially as we move to online, there has to be a way to get the feedback loop tightened up. I mean, one of the slides, I wrote it down, detailed, actionable feedback. It is detailed. I've seen the reports. Those are great. I don't know how actionable it is, I mean, for the individual students at this point.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment, and in particular, I think you would have appreciated our assessment task force conversation about the ability to have almost a real-time score, at least of all the computerized scored items, maybe not the hand-scored items, where you would get that immediately, I'll say within 48 hours, and then the hand-scored items would come to you later, but to at least have some initial feedback would be valuable. And so we're thinking through that again in this RFP of how do you get more real-time immediate feedback in a reporting structure that gives families and kids better information faster.
That's fantastic. It's good for kids, and I think it would also help the politics around testing because parents want to like it and want to see the value in it, and that would give them value.
Bob.
As you acknowledged, and your data shows those students that exited the EL program have done far better, statistically better. Are you really looking into that data to see why and then what you might do and take it to the rest of the class?
I appreciate that question too, because that is one we were pleasantly surprised by, but also excited because we have done a lot of work in this area over the last couple years, and we've elevated it in the vision, we've elevated it in the strategic plan, we've elevated it with our districts and the support. We now actually have, more people at the department thinking about EL every day, and we've elevated it in our ESSA plan. And so we feel like this is just a momentum shift on making sure this isn't lost in your conversation, but it is front and center. And then the training that has been done from the department and through the districts is better than it's ever been. So all of that has to have had some impact, but we are absolutely looking more directly at this data. And we hope in our October meeting, I was asking Sarah if it would be appropriate at the October workshop to show you some connections between what we're seeing in NAEP, what we're seeing in our TN Ready data and ACT data, and show you here are areas where we're strong across the board, here's areas that we're weak, and what can we do collectively to create more urgency around the areas we're weak. Thanks.
I just have one
Sarah.
quick question. I think it is interesting to think about sort of the high school conundrum as we have more students moving to the EPSOs, which is a good trend. But even for our state accountability, will we be able to capture some of that as we look sort of in October and later this fall to sort of know more collectively how our high school students are doing if they are taking more of those advanced courses instead of TN Ready?
Absolutely. We have Evan Kramer sitting in the audience, and we're working on those 5,000 students who are different in terms of how many took U.S. history last year and this year. What were they in? What courses were they in? What were the outcomes of what they were in? And we hope to be able to share some of that just for context around when you see a number dip, but you know more kids are in EPSOs, you have to keep that in mind. That doesn't necessarily mean, oh no, we lost, momentum. It could mean you gained momentum and you pick it up in accountability anyways, but they come out at two different times of the year. And so we've got to be mindful of how we share it too. But we are absolutely picking that up and going to share that with you.
Well, I will miss that presentation in October, but I look forward to following online. So.
You have a good reason.
You can live
I will
stream.
live stream if I'm not there sitting in the back row. And I know our lunch is ready, so I don't know if there's more questions.
Elisa?
Oh, Lisa's question. Great.
So outcomes. So in preparation for the next discussion on this, I mean, it feels to me that, so right there's, of course, similar to your question, I'm very interested in drivers. So whether it's growth, whether it's decline, what's driving both? I mean, it seems to me like having participated in a lot of these conversations at the local school board level and whatever managed teams also that are data oriented and driven, that the temptation is going to be very strong to be like so high level as to be almost meaningless in terms of actually creating change. So, I mean, I could imagine like the slate of things that could end up on a takeaways chart. It's like, our training was great, our this, like, or, like they're all reasonable things. They're not like crazy things. But I have a feeling, like you said, Commissioner, that there are certain things that are going to pop if we choose to dig in, like your calls to the math or to certain districts to find out how did you get the growth in math. I'm not surprised to hear that they said, yeah, I made hard calls around teaching. I mean, and the body of evidence around that is just irrefutable in terms of the drive, like teaching is the driver. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I am hopeful that whatever the prep is between now and that point when we discuss again, that the drivers are somehow rooted either in a very specific context as a use case, like in Metro Nashville, this is like, it was this outcome and we're very certain that these things drove that outcome in this like smaller set of schools, like something more granular to force us to really articulate, like these are the drivers. Because like the body of evidence is irrefutable, for example, on the quality of teaching, we know this. Then the next step is, well, then what do they do to get those teachers? I don't know, like you can get down to like almost too much, like too many levels of granularity, but I would almost rather go there than stay at this huge level of just like, yeah, I know we threw money at this problem broadly, we trained people better broadly. I mean, that's actually not that useful. And so you're probably doing this anyway in terms of the use cases, but I personally would be very interested in seeing that. I think and then the potential policy like implications from that stand to be immense, because you could imagine if we decide to orient around that one takeaway, like actually yes, if you want to see results, and this is such a does to be almost laughable, but it's just hard to operationalize it. But if we actually forced ourselves and said, you know what, it's really in these 20 schools that got the biggest gains across the entire state, the driver was changing, like getting the right teacher in that place. I would like to confront that, and ask, like, what would it take then to replicate, truly, what would it take to replicate that? Yeah. So, and I just drilled down on that one example, but I think the point is granularity will be helpful, I think, in having the bigger discussion.
I agree, because I'll tell you, my latest passion and bandwagon is about teachers. And we're trying to approach this in the rural area that I serve, because it's all over the board in terms of why there is a decline. First of all, students are discouraged discouraged from going into the profession of education. They're discouraged by parents, by society, and actually by teachers. And so our education preparation programs have a decline. And so I have school districts who would like nothing better than to have the most highly effective teachers. However, the university that provides those to them do not have those. They do not have anyone graduating that is a math teacher, just to use that as an example. Basic math period, the higher sciences. So we have a huge issue. We know it's local, regional, state, national. We have to attack it at the root because that is a driver. That is a key driver. There's a lot of other elements. I think some school districts are more successful than others in being able to attract them because they're in the urban area. There's a whole lot of other reasons behind that. But grassroots, I'm working, as I said, in my day job with school districts to change the narrative, to change the language around talking about the profession. Because in general, and I think if you could talk to a lot of teachers, you'd find that many of them have felt discouraged in the past. And I think we're doing a lot to change that. But you can talk to a director of schools who have children. They don't want their children to become teachers. You know, you can talk to a lot of folks. They don't want their child or their grandchild to become a teacher. We have an issue. That's a problem. That's got to change.
And to the comment made earlier, a great point is we know for a fact that 4th and 5th grade understanding of fractions is a very large issue in our state. So we know that for a fact, and we know it shows up again in 6th, 7th, and 8th as you try to make that application, and it shows up again when the kids take the 11th grade ACT. That's a fact. It's a problem, and it has multi-year impact. So I would love to bring to the board, if we know that, and that's pretty granular, then what would we do differently in terms of policy, process, people, all the above, to make sure we address that? We have started by putting out, focus documents, doing training around the very specific areas that we're struggling with, trying to think differently about how we put out information on those. But that's something that's pretty granular, and we've got several of those, and we're going to bring those to you in October. And so if we know them, it's fact-based, and you can see it across multiple measures. It's not just in one test, it's multiple tests. NAEP showing the same thing. What would we do differently in terms of our response to that? So that's the level of granularity I hope we could get to. To your point, we may not understand the drivers like we should, and that's something that we'll try to dig into more before that meeting. So I appreciate the point.
Great discussion. Anything else? Before we adjourn, I do want to find out, are there any items from any of the board members that you want to discuss related to first or second reading items for tomorrow's board meeting? That have not already been discussed. Thank you. Okay. One more thing. Sarah, did you want to say something?
I just have some quick instructions before we...
Well, you go with the instructions because I might have some additional, or maybe I don't have any after you finish.
Well, I just didn't want to forget to remind folks, because we are going to be accommodating the THEC board in addition to our board between now and when we start at 1. So either take your stuff with you or kind of keep it pretty closely organized so that if it needs to be moved around so that we can kind of stagger with our THEC friends, that'll be happening while we're upstairs having lunch. So
That's what I was going to say. Thank you, Sarah.
Good minds.
This workshop is adjourned. Thank you all.